Okay. So, are you on? Oh yeah, there you are. Tom. Oh, there you are. Okay. Well, you're on mute right now, but oh, am I going to have to turn mine down?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
So while you are presenting, I'm gonna have you mute both your laptops because
Okay.
all of the blue dots on the ceiling are very, very good microphones.
Okay.
So that's what I want to have you set up right now.
Okay.
Let me join your meeting.
Just
Could I have the meeting ID, please?
Yeah. When I when I figure out where it is.
Not a problem. Right there, the
There you go.
webinar ID. If you
Yeah.
could read that for me.
941
Thank you.
3552 2158.
Okay, I'm joining now.
Okay.
And then the passcode?
I don't-
May not have.
We may not have one because it's a webinar.
It is telling me to enter one. Interesting. Go to Zoom, please. And then,
Oh, no.
go ahead and click the other window.
That's not the one I want.
And then,
I've got the passcode.
Oh, he's got it.
thank you.
955782.
Perfect. Okay. Now,
Oh, wow.
let's go ahead and mute me. I don't have people.
Uh-oh.
I'm not a host. Go ahead and click participants. Yep. And then we're looking for the Frontier room. Yep. And then go ahead and click more.
Whoops.
And then I need it to be host.
Oh, okay.
Promote to panelist.
Hi, Jessica.
Go ahead and choose promote to panelist.
Oh, yeah, that's probably it.
Rejoining as panelist.
You are muted, right? Or no, Jessica's muted.
Perfect.
Yes, you are muted.
Okay, I'm going to mute you now.
Okay.
No, I won't. It's not going to allow me. So go
No,
ahead
'cause
and
I'm
mute
the
yourself.
host. I'm the host, so.
And because we're using your webcam videos, I won't turn on the videos in the room. It'll just be the microphone. So
Okay.
get your cameras on.
Okay. Can you hear me, Jessica?
I can. Are you doing the slides and are you the one? Hmm. Okay, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Hey, Thomas, we can't hear Jessica.
You may have to give them the ability to unmute themselves. So
I am. Oh,
You have participants on who can hear everything.
participants can hear me. So the participants can hear all three of us, but Julie and Andrew can't hear me.
Jessica, could you say something for me, please?
Hello and welcome.
I saw your lips move, but we heard no sound.
Okay, that's a problem.
Let me make sure the speakers are working right. Okay, try now.
Hello,
Boom,
testing.
there we go.
Hey, okay. I felt pressure. I should have said something cooler. I just didn't have it in me.
Okay, now I'm going to join as an audience member as well.
Well, I see everybody. Or the critics in this. All right. Everybody doing okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Good.
We have attendees on.
All right. Well, I'm signing off. So
All right. We have one question about, is there a handout or link to materials? Oh, now I can't hear Julie. Oh, Julie, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay, try that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think we will be sending that out with the recording.
And there's still a bit of feedback.
Julie, there was significant feedback when you were
Yeah,
talking, so
yeah, the tech guy is working on that.
One of our participants said auxiliary speakers cause feedback.
Yeah, I turned them down. Oh, that's
Do
interesting.
I need to switch them here?
Go ahead and mute yourself real quick so we don't have to be.
Okay, what about? Yes, can you hear us? It sounds clear.
You sound clear. I need to test Julie.
Hey, Jessica, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, I've got Jessica sounded like Stephen Hawking.
Okay, that might just be my voice right now because I have laryngitis. We'll try that again.
I guess we probably want him to use that.
Okay. That's funny. I got a good laugh out of that though. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you.
Looks like we have a few more attendees.
Okay. That sounds a lot clearer. Will each of you test? Say something.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3.
Perfect.
Okay, you ready? Okay, it is a few minutes after 1 o'clock, so we will begin the webinar. Thank you everyone for participating. This is a webinar on the Title IX regulations on sexual harassment grievance procedure. And our two guest speakers today are Andrew Manna from Church Hill in Antrim and Jessica Heiser from Church Hill in Antrim. And Andrew is going to start us off. And if you have questions, we would prefer you use the Q&A rather than the chat. But if you use the chat, we will be monitoring both, but we prefer that you use the Q&A. So after I get the shared screen up here, we will begin.
All right, as we are getting the PowerPoint pulled up, I'm just going to make sure one more time. Lisa and Jessica, you can hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm going to assume then for our 107 participants that the audio is clear. If anyone has any tech issues in that regard, please let us know. We've got someone on hand to help us. Julie mentioned just a moment ago our Title IX training for October 9th. We're happy to be panelists in conjunction with Lisa and Julie for the Indiana School Boards Association. I'll just do a next slide when we're ready because Julie will be our slide driver. So driving forward, next slide. Pictures we've already introduced, next slide. And this was something that we had, this doesn't really apply because we have a panelist format today, so we'll go next slide. We mentioned chat feature. I think we've already had several of you in the participants using our chat feature. Julie will be monitoring that for us. We are open to, if we can, inserting some of your comments or questions along the way. We will have an opportunity to pause, also to take a break, and we'll try to catch up with the chat questions. So please use that. In this new format of presenting virtually, we do want to still try to engage and have interaction, and from all of you all over your remote areas of the state. So already somebody mentioned, will we be sending out the PowerPoint? I think Julie mentioned that'll be coming out to you as participants. So we have about 111 of you signed in, so thank you. Next slide. Let's start with a little bit of background. And part of the reason for our training today, Jessica and I were going over this again this morning. There is a significant change with respect to Title IX and sexual harassment investigations for schools. And I think I want to emphasize that at the onset. This is important. We started back in July, starting to have some conversations with schools, knowing full well that you were in COVID preparation, trying to get back to school. We have had discussions through our office, through the ISBA, through the Office of Civil Rights, that we knew that school districts would be unrolling and training themselves throughout the course of the fall. Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you've had some contacts where U.S. Department of Education or Office of Civil Rights folks acknowledge that fact of the ongoing training.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Did you want to mention with respect to what they commented to you about training themselves?
So the Office for Civil Rights actually was just as surprised when these regulations came out, as the rest of the world was. They were not given any heads up by the federal government that this was coming down. And so the quick turnaround that you'll hear us talk about, where these regulations came out right in the middle of COVID shutdowns and then were supposed to be effective come August, OCR themselves were trying to train themselves and understand the regulations themselves. I actually had an investigator ask me if Churchill and Antrim would come help them train themselves because they were just as surprised as the rest of us. So they are catching up and they are giving schools grace with how to get trained and how to get everybody caught up trained, because they are needing to give themselves grace too in order to get it caught up.
So the background, again, is that with this significant change, that's what we're going over today. What is that change? How does it impact you? I think we're apologetic as the messengers here that this is hitting during a very difficult school year to begin with. And now we're having to tell you about another layer of extra work to be done. But it is a change. It is something that has to be implemented now, immediately, as soon as you can get the training and the procedures in place. But for the last couple of years, surrounding the background of Title IX, it's the changes it deal with the fact that from May 2020, the United States Department of Education put out new regulations beginning in effect August 14th of 2020. Now, in this Title IX definition, we've heard over years about equity in athletics and athletic participation, having equal resources in sports and for males and females and those types of issues with Title IX. But this officially, as of the regulations we're talking about, the impact sexual harassment, officially recognize a Title IX coordinator and more focus on the subject of denying and excluding students and others participation in education. And so what does that mean? What does it mean in this definition of Title IX to be excluded from participation or denied the benefits? This is a bit of what we're going to dive into today and really get into the weeds for the training purposes. And Jessica and I were talking about with Julie and Lisa as well, why do we have to train everyone? Well, for a couple of different reasons. This is more than train the trainer. This is almost everyone that could potentially be in an assistant principal, counselor, principal role, having to take a report of sexual harassment needs to know about this information. So we'll start with the onset of Title IX, and next slide, the background then by the numbers we've been looking at for the past year and a half. They the United States Department of Education announced some of these proposed regulations. There were 124,000 comments from school or public individuals across the country about these implementation of these new regulations. 25 pages of regulations and 207 pages, or 2007 pages. And again, August 14th is when they were to go into effect. I do want to make sure I emphasize as well, this is from the School Boards Association, from Churchill and Antrim. No political affiliation on either side, but we certainly have seen the Title IX regulations with sexual harassment ebb and flow based on who's in administration. And I think that is natural for any laws that change that impact school districts. But it is interesting that especially when it comes to sexual harassment, there really have been, from Republican to Democrat to Republican again, really have been a strong movement towards the impact on sexual harassment, sexual assault investigations on college and universities and K through 12, of any laws that got changed and make an impact on what you all have to do in a daily life of being educators. This law tends to move back and forth and either be more strict or less strict based on administration. So we're sorry for that, but it is a change that we now have to implement by law. So next slide. So the new standard The new standard really has to evolve from the old standard, and we'll go to the first United States Supreme Court case just to give you a little bit of social studies lesson throughout the course of our presentation. But this very first case, Title IX case, Cannon versus University, it was a case that dealt with individual not being admitted to a university, denied admission based on sex. And you've heard a lot recently about the United States Supreme Court having 9 members. This was a decision that was 6-3, 6 in favor, 3 in the minority. It was a 1964 case, and essentially said that there can be a private lawsuit, private right of action under Title IX. So it provides protection for individuals that can then be enforced through a private lawsuit for those that are using federal funds. The second case, Franklin versus Gwinnett, expanded even further, and this was not until 1992. It was a unanimous decision, and the only remaining United States Supreme Court justice who is currently still on the Supreme Court that was involved in this case from 92 was Clarence Thomas. So Clarence Thomas, still on there today, was involved in this case. This was a student sexually harassed by a teacher, and it said that you can also get money damages. So not only can you get a lawsuit under Cannon, you can have money damages under Franklin versus Gwinnett. Now, that resonates and makes us realize why we have to pay attention. Next slide. Going further, I just mentioned the private individual rights then are enforced by the administrative agencies like the Office of Civil Rights. We mentioned them a few minutes ago. We often deal with the Office of Civil Rights out of Chicago. We do find them to be pretty balanced and do a good job in being objective. But they are the administrative agency that investigates, and they can place funds, federal funds, at risk, while judicial court proceedings do not. Those are money damages. So you've heard maybe through Indiana School Board Association or from presentations in the past, there is an Office of Civil Rights standard, and there's a court proceeding standard, and we'll show you that here again as a refresher in just a second. So next slide. I have the good fortune that Julie can look across and see me here, so she knows when I'm about ready. In the next court case, Gebser versus Lago, this is a 1998 case. And again, social studies, political science majors, you might find interesting that this was a 5-4 decision in 1998. And it really was a student-teacher sexual relationship case that expanded again and said, what's the standard under Title IX? How do we define whether Title IX has denied someone education? Well, in that court case, they started to bring out these terms like actual knowledge, deliberate indifference, and what do those mean? So we use that as a foundation to then to move into 1999, Davis versus Monroe. And if it's a Davis versus Monroe case where there is a committed by a peer, student on student sexual harassment, we add the standard of severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. So from these two cases, you get the actual knowledge, the deliberate indifference, and the severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that would deny someone. So we created this 3-part test from the Gebser and Davis standards. And really, those are the starting points when the Office of Civil Rights comes involved. And it's a starting point for the interpretation from the United States Department of Education as well. But again, as I mentioned, I'm going to slow down just for a second. Over the last 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 years, this has evolved back and forth. And if you'll go to the next one, Julie. I mentioned the side-by-side. Well, we started then to get the interpretation from the Department of Education that was a little bit more broad than the court standard. So from the United States Department of Education, again, depending on the politics of administration, previously decided that the department interpretations were broader than the court. They were almost like strict liability. So meaning that if you had something happen as a school, you were automatically liable for a sexual harassment, student on student, teacher on student. So the school was to take action when it was severe, persistent, or pervasive. You recall just a moment ago, I mentioned under the Davis case, it was and. But then in 2001, the department felt their guidance that they felt they did not have to use the Gebser-Davis Supreme Court cases, that they could have a separate standard for enforcement, separate and apart from what the United States Supreme Court said, which led to, go to the next slide, this side-by-side. So for a number of years, we've seen when we've presented and trained schools that you ended up with, on the right side, the United States Supreme Court cases that I mentioned to you from the mid-90s, which meant you had to have actual knowledge, severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, must effectively bar the individual, and the response must not be clearly unreasonable. That was what was the court decision if you were sued in court. But unfortunately, on the left side, the Office of Civil Rights was more strict, and they were saying things like you had knowledge or you reasonably should have known, severe, pervasive, or persistent, and it interferes with participation, and the response must include effective measures. So you can see if you look at this chart and the side-by-side that schools for a number of years were dealing with different standards. One standard if you were in court, and one standard if you were before the Office of Civil Rights, and it was causing a lot of confusion. So that is some of the background. So 2020, what is the new standard? To boil down 2 hours of our presentation today, here is the standard. The department now believes the adaptations of those Supreme Court cases that we just talked about a moment ago, that allegations or incidents of sexual harassment include things that we need to consider, like freedom of speech, but they also need to consider things like the age and maturity of students that is different than a workplace environment. So again, I'm trying to stay neutral and not show that this is not a political presentation by any means. This is giving you the facts of what we now have to deal with. But what the U.S. Department of Education is telling us, and I am the messenger relaying that, is that high school students and middle school students act immature. And they are saying, because of that, there needs to be a different approach than a workplace environment harassment standard. Whether we agree with that or not, that's what the United States Department of Education is looking at. So they are trying to get to a level of consistency, to go to the next slide, that they believe that the court decision standard and the administrative enforcement standard, that side-by-side chart that I showed you a couple minutes ago, it should be the same standard. Now, I can definitely see the benefits of that, so we're not confused by which standard we apply. But it is certainly going to make a change in the way we define sexual harassment. It's going to make a change in the way we report it, and the way we investigate it, and the way we process it. So that's, again, the importance of why we're here today. All right, I'll go into our definitions, and we'll go to the first definitions, sexual harassment.
Andrew, I'm pretty sure you just said you boiled down our 2-hour presentation. So aren't we done now?
So I think we actually gained participants. We have more participants now listening.
Okay.
Sexual harassment means conduct on the basis of sex that satisfies one or more of the following: a school employee conditioning the provision of an aid, benefit, or service on an individual's participation in unwelcome sexual conduct. This is the quid pro quo teacher-student type sexual harassment. Next one, type 2. Type 2, unwelcome conduct determined by a reasonable person to be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies activity. With the third prong covering most everything physical, this prong is focused on verbal and electronic harassment. The standard is subjective with respect to the unwelcomeness of the conduct. But as to the elements of severity, pervasiveness, and denial, determinations are made by a reasonable person in the shoes of the complainant. So when you're training now a investigator under Title IX, you have to look at determinations of the severity, the pervasiveness, based on a reasonable person standard. Why severe and pervasive? Well, some of the history that we went over a few minutes ago, the United States Department of Education thinks the nature of education means a higher quantity of low-grade offensive speech must be tolerated as part of freedom of expression. Again, please understand that Lisa, Julie, Jessica, myself are the messengers. Whether you agree with that or not, that's what we're being told is now the regulation, the law, and the interpretation from the United States Department of Education. So sex-based conduct towards students must be severe to rise to the level of sexual harassment. So there are going to be exchange of comments, speech, ideas, things that might happen in the schoolhouse that we previously felt were sexual harassment that may now have a bit more flexibility to them, I guess I'll say. Next slide. Sexual assault. Jessica, could you help me here? Because I'm pausing on this one for a second. I think under this one, there was some interpretation about defining consent, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute. So the regulations leave open the definition of consent and allow each school district to define consent on their own. So you will see that as model policies come out, Church Tittle Antrim has model policies, Neola has model policies, ISBA has model policies. As these policies and procedures come out, you'll see that the definition of consent in these policies will vary because it is entirely up to the school district to define consent. What we have done is really looked at consent in two different ways. One is the criminal definition of consent. And under Indiana law, anyone under the age of 16 is incapable of consent. So that kind of eliminates the vast majority of your K through 12 students to begin with. Nobody can consent if they're under 16. And then you'll see a lot of flexibility in the way each school district defines consent. So you may see words like, it has to be a voluntary act by two separate people or more. You'll see things about how it manifests itself in either words or gestures. But it will vary substantially because the Title IX regulations just absolutely refuse to define consent as it applies to some sort of sexual assault or some sort of physical act.
Let's go to the next slide. I think gives it a little bit of an illustration. As an example, so for example, under sexual harassment type 3, we would look at fondling. And fondling defined by the Clery Act, referring to the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting, the touching of private body parts of another person for the purpose of sexual gratification without the consent of the victim. So some of what we've heard as examples, again, would be that if there is a student walking down the hallway in a high school who slaps the behind of another student, and under the new definition, would that be for sexual gratification? And would it be without the consent of the victim? So as we start to think through these new definitions, that'll be some of the considerations for investigators to look at the definition of sexual harassment. While sexual harassment definition does not identify grooming behaviors as a distinct category of misconduct, some grooming behaviors may constitute sexual harassment, and behaviors that do not constitute sexual harassment may still be deemed inappropriate, even if they're not sexual harassment. So it could be a disciplinary matter, but not necessarily sexual harassment. That can make sense to you.
Andrew, can I interject?
Yes,
on
please.
that? Yeah, I think on that point, the regulations do keep emphasizing that while the conduct may not be sexual harassment under the definitions of the regulations, it still could be a violation of your other student conduct rules, and therefore you have to proceed under your local rules on that. So, keep that in mind as you go through this process. It may be that the investigator says, well, this isn't really sexual harassment, but it may violate, one of your student rules or employee conduct rules or something like that, that you will need, to also investigate, but it wouldn't be under this regulation, and you wouldn't have to follow all the detailed procedures that we're going to describe later today under the regulations. Andrew, we do have a couple questions.
Okay.
The first question is, so if you received a report, is that actual knowledge? I think he's going back to your first definition of sexual harassment. And you might be getting into that later, so if you want to defer that answer.
Jess, I think you get into that with the reporting standard.
Okay,
Yes.
all right, so we'll put that one. And then the other one is, will participants receive copies of various standards, et cetera, that are being discussed today? Yes, you will. We will send out the PowerPoint with the recording, so you will receive through PowerPoint as well.
Okay. All right, next slide. We'll keep us rolling here.
Okay.
Complainant. This is going to take in consideration that we are going to have some new definition. And so complainant means an individual who is alleged to be the victim of conduct that would constitute sexual harassment. So keep in mind, there is now almost like when you see in television or movies about a alleged criminal, there is this presumption of innocence for the alleged sexual harasser in the new definition. So complainant is said to be the alleged victim. We'll go to the next. Respondent then is an individual who has been reported to be the perpetrator of conduct. Complainant, respondent, next. We'll go through
We
these
do that one too.
a little
Yeah,
fast.
these are quick ones.
The formal complaint is going to be different than a report. And Jessica's going to help get us into that in just a couple minutes. But there's a difference now between formal complaint means a document filed by a complainant or signed by the Title IX coordinator. This again makes it important to know who is your Title IX coordinator, requesting formally that there is an investigation of sexual harassment. So there's going to be a difference between a report and a formal complaint, and some things that are done in between with a report and formal complaint. The next one, supportive measures. This is a new term. We'll introduce it here at the beginning, then we'll come back to it as we go through presentation. This is something that can be provided even before a formal complaint is filed. So if you have a report of harassment and it hasn't proceeded into a formal investigation, you can offer things that are known as supportive measures. So without unreasonably burdening either party, it's measures to provide safety and to allow both individuals to continue getting an education. So it could be to the complainant, it could be to the respondent, and it's either before or after the filing of a formal complaint. So keep in mind supportive measures as something that is going to be a new strategy to use when sexual harassment is reported. Here's some examples. Counseling. For university level would be campus or housing modifications. Increased security, modifications of class schedules. Some of these are maybe best practices that all of us have done over the years anyway as educators, but now you're putting a certain label and term to it, so calling it supportive measures. So remember, before the report or before the formal complaint or after, it could be used to assist both individuals getting back to their education. Supportive, go to the next one, supportive measures cannot unreasonably burden, meaning that if there's a removal from a sports team or there's something that you have defined as discipline, you would not then use it as a supportive measure. I actually think the next slide, Julie does a better job. Let's go to that one.
Yeah.
So possibly anything that's possible disciplinary sanctions described in your school grievance or investigations. Example, if a school has listed ineligibility to play on a sports team or hold a student government position as a disciplinary sanction, then it would not be something that you would use as a supportive measure. If, on the other hand, a school's grievance process does not describe or list a specific action as a disciplinary sanction, then whether you can use that action may be taken as a supportive measure for the complainant is determined by an analysis of whether the action is punitive and does not unreasonably burden the respondent. Again, you may have already heard a preview of what these changes under Title IX were going to side with, and it certainly does side with the respondent, being more favorable to somebody who's alleged to have done sexual harassment. So if you're going to use a supportive measure, it can't unreasonably burden the respondent.
Andrew, while you're taking a breath there, a question. How detailed and graphic must the definitions be in policies adopted by the school district? Some policies I have seen seem to be utilizing definitions that are similar to those used in the criminal courts. While you're thinking, Ange, I'll answer this from the ISBA perspective. I tend not to put definitions in the policies. Mostly put those in administrative regulations. I know I've seen some policies out there that include the federal definition of sexual assault, which could be pretty graphic, and some of the other crimes that are listed in the regulations. I don't think that's necessary. I think that's something that can be put in administrative regulations or other information that is put out by the school corporation. So I guess the ISBA policy would be, and the ISBA policy does not have the definitions in it. So I would put those more in administrative regs, but I know some people have different views on that. So
Sure.
If you'd like to chime in on that.
No, I think we agree with that. Jessica, you're nodding your head, I think, and our policy people in our office would agree. Keep in mind, there are a couple of things in the new Title IX regulations that are not defined. We will point those out here in a moment, but I think from what Julie just talked about, we agree, Jess.
And then the second one is their complaint form or template form that could be shared. I know
Jess?
ISBA hasn't done one yet.
Yeah, we have. Jess, you want to comment about forms?
Yeah, so Church on the interim, we have a toolkit available. So feel free to contact Andrew or I. We have forms for pretty much everything we're talking about, in addition to model policies and model procedures. But we take a similar position that Julie was saying with ISBA's policies is we include less than more in the policies. And then we put more substance into the forms that people fill out in the administrative guidelines where the real meat of the substance is.
All right, I think we have a couple more things I need to clarify with supportive measures before I transition to Jessica. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's just put the icing on the cake here. Inherently punitive or not, when you're thinking of supportive measures, it sending a student to the principal's office, changing student seating or class assignments, such actions may be taken to maintain order, protect student safety. So you need to be considerate of, without having gone through the grievance process, making sure that it's not punitive. We started to brainstorm this idea a couple of days ago, whether there is a right of action for the respondent if you haven't gone through the grievance process or you haven't gone through the right steps of this new process. And so By contrast, expulsions and suspensions constitute disciplinary action that could not be imposed unless a result of having gone through the grievance process. Just keep in mind the term supportive measures, and keep in mind that that can be done early on when you have a report of sexual harassment.
And also, the supportive measures can be for the respondent and the complainant. So, and I think that's a little different than what we've looked at in the past. So you have to really kind of look at both parties and see what supportive measures may be appropriate, even at the informal
That's it.
process. So.
All right, next one. Again, this is all kind of looking at pre-investigation at this moment. Post-exoneration supportive measures, the school has discretion whether to continue supportive measures after a determination of non-responsibility. So if you go through the investigation steps, which we're going to outline here in a few minutes, and you determine there's no responsibility, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop the supportive measures, even if the allegations were false or unfounded, but rather you could still support the respondent or the complainant. It just may mean when you did the investigation, there wasn't sufficient evidence to find the respondent responsible or to meet the technical definitions. But as we said, it might still be a disciplinary measure, or you might still want to give supportive measures to the complainant. So next slide. I mentioned a moment ago, nice hieroglyphics on the chalkboard here. When you put it like that, it makes complete sense. Well, there are a couple of things that are not defined in our new regulations. Days, for example, the department does not require a specific method for calculating days, and schools have flexibility to adopt the method that works best for your operations. We had recommended, I hadn't put my thoughts together with Julie, but we recommend using instructional days. So you may want to look at redefining in your policy or your procedures locally for your investigations that it'll be instructional days. And then last, I think we've already mentioned consent. The Education Department's Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights will not require recipients to adopt a particular definition. So left to the discretion of recipients, many who you have to follow state law for purposes of defining what you mean by consent. Schools must clearly define consent and must apply that definition consistently. So to the question a few minutes ago, no level of detail in some of those definitions, but you do need to define consent. All right, Julie or Jessica, Lisa, should I pause? We've given a lot of history, we've given a lot of background, we've talked about definitions. I hopefully for our 125 participants have emphasized that this is a big change. Are we ready to proceed forward?
I just have one comment. You didn't talk about this definition, but just to clarify, now we're not looking at, whether they committed sexual harassment or whether we have this term of responsibility or non-responsibility, which basically just is, after the investigation, is the respondent responsible for engaging in the conduct of sexual harassment as defined in the regs, or are they not? So that's just a new term that we use that we haven't really used before. So
Sure.
I just wanted to point that out.
That's a great point. Responsibility versus non-responsibility. Yes, that's a great point. I think some of that will come out when we talk about doing the investigation.
Right.
All right.
I do not see any questions on what we've had. I think we've answered them for this section. So if we want to move on.
Jessica, would you like to transition us?
All right, so Andrew has gone over, oh yes, our transition slide is children's books and the theme of coronavirus. So this is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Home.
Jess, real fast, I'm just going to make sure you are pretty soft in our room. Is it audio loud for the participants?
I can turn it up if you need me.
Yeah.
I'll try to scream too. I'm sorry guys, my voice is
There you go.
horrible.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so Julie, you can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about actual knowledge and what triggers a school's obligation to respond. There is a broader definition now of what actual knowledge is. And we've had a couple of questions say a recipient with actual knowledge of sexual harassment in an education program or activity of the recipient against a person in the United States must respond in a manner that is not deliberately indifferent. I'm going to pause right there for a second and just talk about a couple of those things. Number one, actual knowledge is defined broadly in the regulations. It could be the school heard about sexual harassment in a newspaper article. It could be somebody, a student brought a complaint of sexual harassment to a teacher, to a food services worker, to a janitorial staff person. Actual knowledge is very broad under these new definitions, and that's kind of a scary prospect for us, because now it means that anybody under the roof who has any actual knowledge of sexual harassment in a scope of your activity or program needs to respond to it appropriately. Now, responding appropriately generally means that people need to work it up the chain. They need to bring it to the attention of the Title IX coordinator. It doesn't mean that your teachers or your janitorial staff or your food services staff needs to understand how to deal with sexual harassment, but it means that they need to recognize it when they get a report of it, and they need to work it up the chain to their supervisor or their Title IX coordinator. It also means that defining the scope of your programs and activities will be very important. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, because if you can't define what is school and what is not school, you will run into a lot of gray areas in Title IX. It's going to be very important for you to look at your activities and your program and draw a line between what does Title IX fall under and what does Title IX not fall under my scope of activities. Then a recipient is only deliberately indifferent if their response to the sexual harassment is clearly unreasonable in light of the known circumstances. Clearly unreasonable would mean you didn't do anything about it. Or you were, you went to a teacher who was accused of sexual harassment. You asked the teacher, hey, are you having a relationship with a student? Teacher says no. You say, okay, we'll move on. That's obviously indifferent. You need to have some level of investigation into those kind of situations. Go ahead, Julie, to next slide. Actual knowledge means notice of the sexual harassment or allegations to the school corporation's Title IX coordinator or any school official who has authority to institute corrective measures, or, here's your kicker, any employee of an elementary or secondary school. That's the big, big expansion under these new Title IX regulations. And it's very similar to a child abuse and reporting requirement. It's now everybody under your roof. If they are an employee of your school district, they are going to be responsible for knowing how to respond to notice of a sexual harassment allegation. That also would include then things like your coaches who are only seasonal coaches and might just be on an ECA stipend. It's going to include your janitorial staff. It's going to include your instructional aides. It's any employee of an elementary or secondary school. Okay, next slide. We talked already, this is a lot about it's very similar to a child abuse and neglect reporting obligation, and it does include your lay coaches or your extracurricular sponsors. If someone gets any money from you, they're responsible for reporting Title IX. You are obligated now to prominently display your Title IX coordinator contact information on your website and state that any person can report sexual harassment by any of those means necessary: person, mail, telephone, email, using that contact information. A report can be made at any time, including non-business hours. And some districts have decided to set up kind of a blanket email address, like Title IX coordinator at schooldistrict.k12, so that you have continuity when your staff turns over. And there's one easy place to get all Title IX complaints or reports. Okay, next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about the educational program or activity, and this is where it gets really important for you to think about your personal district and how things work at your district. Because Title IX now says that you are only responsible for responding to sexual harassment when it occurs in your educational program or activity against a person in the United States. Now that sounds kind of funny to clarify the United States, but think about it. It basically means if something happens during study abroad, you're not responsible for it. It's only against something that happens against a person here, but it has to happen within a location, event, or circumstance over which the school exercised substantial control over both the respondent, so that's the alleged harasser, and also the context in which the sexual harassment occurred. It also includes buildings owned or controlled by student organizations. So that's usually in a post-secondary environment like Greek houses. But think very carefully about this for a second. You have to have substantial control over both the respondent, so the alleged harasser, and you have to have substantial control over which the context in which the sexual harassment occurred in order for your Title IX obligations to be triggered. Now, Julie mentioned earlier, this is just Title IX. So, you still have the obligations under your general student code of conduct to respond to incidents that might occur on the weekend, after hours, things like that, if they create a substantially foreseeable disruption to your school environment. That still exists. That's under all of your normal student code of conduct. That's under Indiana law. That's under your criminal things that happen on the weekend that can affect your school environment. We're just talking about Title IX and just talking about sexual harassment. And these new regulations basically say, as a public school, your obligations have substantially limited because now you have to have substantial control over the alleged harasser and the context in which the harassment occurred in order for you to have Title IX obligations triggered. There's a next slide kind of gets deeper into this. If you can go to the next slide, Julie. Okay, this is a example of things on the left that would trigger your Title IX obligations, situations on the right that probably do not trigger your Title IX obligations. So situations on the left that are pretty straightforward, any sort of harassment in a school building or on school property, any sort of harassment in your school or extracurricular activities. Obviously, those are pretty straightforward within the scope of your program. The regulations also suggest that a teacher who would be visiting a student's home to deliver a book and then engaging in sexual harassment while at the student's home would still trigger Title IX because the teacher going to the home under the guise of doing a book drop-off falls under an educational scope and activity. Situations where you're off campus, but it's a school activity like prom in a rented ballroom. If we ever have proms again and we're ever having fun with students close by again. Students who are using their personal cell phone to perpetuate online harassment during class time definitely falls within the scope of your activities because they're sitting in class. And then for colleges, Greek houses would also fall. But look at the right side. These are things that probably don't trigger Title IX because you do not have control over the respondent and the context in which it happened. A house party on the weekend. That's every Title IX coordinator and superintendent and administrator's worst nightmare is you've got a kid who comes in on Monday and says, I was sexually assaulted on Saturday at the house party. What are you going to do about it? Right now, under these new regulations, Title IX basically says there's not much we can do about it. And that is a big shift in the Title IX regulations. Now, there's an asterisk on that, and I'm going to talk about where there are situations where you still would have Title IX obligations. But in general, these new regulations really limit your obligation to respond to something that happens off campus, off hours. We've already talked about international field trips or study abroad don't fall within Title IX now because they're not against a person in the United States. And then students who would use personal cell phones to perpetuate online harassment at home on the weekend. You don't have control over that situation and therefore Title IX obligations aren't triggered. Of course, you still have obligations under student code of conduct, anti-bullying, that kind of thing. but Title IX is not triggered. The other part is harassment that is committed by a student or staff from a different school. So for example, if the harassment happened at an away volleyball game, think about, do you have control over the alleged recipient, or I'm sorry, the alleged respondent? No, you don't. It's a student from another school. You can't do much about it. Did you have control over the context in which it happened? Yeah, you probably did. It was an educational activity. It was an extracurricular activity that you had control over, but we don't have control over that student or staff from an away team. Therefore, you probably don't have Title IX obligations triggered at that point. I'm on for my next slide. So what you need to do is you need to define the scope of your educational program and activity. Not only do you need to make sure that your administrators are trained on it, but then you also have to define the scope in the public training materials that you are now obligated to put forward. So everybody is aware of what you consider the scope of your Title IX obligations. And we have an example on the next slide. So for the example here, and again, this will be different district to district. This is where you really need to sit down and say, what falls under the scope of my educational programs and activities? I'm just gonna read the bottom paragraph for you because that's the most important. This is an example of scope. All activities taking place within a school building or on corporation property, any athletic, extracurricular, or co-curricular activity that is officially recognized by the corporation and led by a corporation employee, computer and internet networks, digital platforms, or computer hardware or software that is owned, operated by, or used in the operations of the corporation. So this is just an example for you, but it's stuff to think about because, for example, let's say you have an extracurricular activity that meets on your campus, that has that has all your students involved, but is not led by a corporation employee. Maybe they're led by a volunteer. Maybe they're led by somebody from the local church. Maybe they're led by just an adult chaperone. That would not fall under the scope of the educational programs here. So you have to be very, very careful about defining this scope and training people on this scope because sexual harassment that happens outside of this definition would not fall under your obligations. So if something happened during that extracurricular activity that's led by a volunteer, and they came to you and said, look, Boy Scouts were meeting on our campus and something happened, if it doesn't fall under this definition, it's not something that you have to respond to from a Title IX standpoint. You may still need to respond to it from other standpoints, but you probably won't go into a full-blown Title IX investigation because it doesn't fall within the scope of what you have substantial control over.
Jessica, could maybe.
All right, I'm gonna go to my next slide here and answer questions.
Jessica, maybe between you and Julie and I for a second though. Go back, sorry,
Oh,
Julie.
I'm sorry.
Jess, when I'm thinking out loud and just trying to get some audience chat or questions going here, how do we distinguish that if later we end up with a Title IX OCR complaint or lawsuit? How do we distinguish, hey, we really, this wasn't on campus or we didn't have control of these people. So yeah, we looked at it under a disciplinary violation, but we didn't look at it as a Title IX. What's the paper trail here look like for that?
So in that situation, I think that the report that we know about and the Title IX coordinator having a look at that report and talking to that person who makes that report, and we're going to go into the difference between a report and a complaint here in a minute, but having some sort of paper trail that the Title IX coordinator reviewed that report, looked at the scope, and made a determination is going to be super important. We're also going to talk about record retention, where those records have to be saved for 7 years. So I'd want some sort of documentation from your Title IX coordinator that somebody trained on the scope of an educational program has been the one who has made that determination.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's, I think the regs are pretty clear. All reports go to the Title IX coordinator, and the Title IX coordinator figures out if it's one that needs to be investigated or not, or a formal complaint filed or an informal process completed. So I think it is the Title IX coordinator who probably should make that determination. And again, put it in writing, you know, whether it's in an email or letter or note or whatever, and just keep documentation of that. Because I think later too, in the regulations, when it talks about the records retention, I mean, it talks about records from like the first report of sexual harassment all the way up. So I think even though you determine it's not sexual harassment, it was a report, and that does need to be retained.
Just, I don't know if you can see these, but a couple popped up while we were, well, you know, this was my hope. We'd get a couple of questions.
Yeah, I would say there's some questions, yeah.
I see some of the questions. Can we go to the next slide? I think it's going to answer some of these questions.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to talk really quickly about this off-campus piece, because some of these questions are about off-campus, off-hours stuff. In general, this is what the regs say. Off-campus, off-hours assaults or harassment does not trigger school liability. We've already talked about that, but I said there's a big asterisk there. It will incur liability and your obligation to respond under Title IX if it happens as part of your operations. And that's kind of what we talked about with either something off-campus that you've done, like prom at a rented off-campus, or if you exercise substantial control over the respondent and the context of the alleged harassment that occurred off campus. So for example, some of the questions have been asked about teachers communicating with students off campus, off hours, electronically through social media. In those situations, you do exercise control over the teacher and under the context in which it's happening. The teacher and the student only know each other through the school. So I do think that would probably trigger your Title IX liability. And then number 3 is about Greek houses and post-secondary. However, here's the asterisk to the asterisk, like there's the loophole to the loophole. If the complainant is no longer enrolled when the complaint is filed, or if the perpetrator is no longer enrolled or employed there is no reason for the school to do an investigation because the school can't do anything at the end of it. This is all new under the regulations too. It used to be that even if that person who was the alleged harasser was gone, we still had to do the investigation. That's not the case anymore. The new regulations basically say if the perpetrator or the complainant are no longer there, you don't have to go through with an investigation. There were questions also about including law enforcement in the investigation process. I should mention, I mentioned earlier about this doesn't affect your student code of conduct or your bullying obligations. It also doesn't affect your DCS reporting obligations. So even if you get the allegation that something happened off campus, off hours, and you look at it and say, that doesn't fall under the scope of our activities, we don't have a Title IX obligation, you definitely still have a child abuse and reporting obligation. You would definitely involve law enforcement in that process. However, it would most likely be that law enforcement would completely take over that process. You would not take over it from a Title IX perspective. There are certainly situations where your Title IX obligation for an investigation and your law enforcement investigation will run concurrently. But don't for 1 minute think that this releases us from DCS reporting obligations.
And on that note, Jessica, I just want to point out that ISBA we've always taken the position that law enforcement has a different standard. They're looking at crimes. Our standard is looking at violations of our rules or Title IX or Title VII or whatever. And it's 2 different types of investigations, 2 different standards to meet. So really, sometimes bringing law enforcement in can godly move up everything. And sometimes I know administrators like to wait until the law enforcement has completed their investigation. Well, that can be a long time. That could be weeks or months sometimes. And I think especially with the Title IX situation, it has to be addressed fairly quickly. So I would agree with you. I would not bring law enforcement in on the Title IX issue. There may be a criminal issue that, yes, they should be a part of it, but not necessarily that. Okay, then another question here is, what if harassment takes place on a school-issued device or on a personal device using a school-issued Gmail or Microsoft account on the weekend off campus? I think
Yeah, so I'm seeing Brad and Doug ask similar questions about school issued Wi-Fi or school issued devices, which are a great way to throw into your scope. I would say that the biggest problem you're going to have here is when you define the scope of your educational program or activity, you need to define if those school issued devices or school issued Wi-Fi on school buses is included in your scope. And that's up to you. You get to define that. But that's where you're going to have to think very carefully about what happens in my district. You know, we have some districts that are sending Wi-Fi on school buses out during coronavirus to a significant portion of their population. You got some schools that aren't doing that at all. So I would be very, very cautious when you're defining the scope of your educational program and activity to think about those scenarios and say, does this fall into our scope or not? Because it's up to you to figure out if you want to define that as part of your scope.
Yeah, and a very good point, Jessica. But I think on that too, to a certain extent, you may also want to consider what are, you know, parents / students / staff going to think of that. I mean, a lot of parents might think, well, hey, this was a device that was provided to the school, or they're doing this on the school provided email account. You know, isn't that the school responsibility to take care of? So I think that's another consideration too, with respect to defining your scope, and again, making sure your patrons, students, and staff understand what that scope is, so that you know, they know this thing, especially with respect to the Wi-Fi and electronic devices. You know, because that can be such a gray area sometimes. I think we do need to make that clear. Okay, I think we have a couple more questions. Some of them may be answered later, and we can defer those. How would a school secure and catalog physical evidence? And
You
evidence,
shouldn't.
I'm sorry,
Don't. If you have physical evidence, you need to be talking to a police officer. You don't need to be talking to anyone in your school district. Physical evidence, as far as like records are concerned, we're going to get into that and how to catalog and do these investigations. But if you're talking about, you know, actual garments or any sort of, you know, criminal activity, you should not have anything to do with that. You need to be calling your police and having them deal with that. There's a question about the preponderance of evidence. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. Just on the physical evidence. With respect to sexual harassment, we rarely have actual physical evidence in kind of the traditional sense of what we're used to defining sexual harassment as. I think now that it's expanded into the criminal arena, yeah, we may see more physical evidence, but I think it's going to be there's not really going to be all that much physical evidence. So yeah, then Jessica, there's one other percent.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about evidentiary standards here in a minute, so I'm going to delay that. But Bob asked a good question. As a result of COVID, students might contact teachers outside of school hours because of remote learning or e-learning. If a report is made, would that be included in the scope? I would say yes. I think in that situation, you do have substantial control over both the harasser and the context in which it happened. And of course, COVID has kind of thrown us all off here a little bit, but that situation to me would trigger your Title IX obligations. All right, so defining, oh, sorry, go ahead, one more.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Campus activities, did we hit that one?
We've already talked about this too. And again, off-campus behavior, you still have your normal obligations for DCS, bullying, any sort of student code of conduct, criminal stuff, you still have that there. Okay, go ahead. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about reports versus complaints. I'm going to talk about reports. Andrew's going to talk about complaints. A report is the very first thing you hear about. A report is somebody just telling you something. A report is any sort of disclosure. It can happen from the actual complainant, the victim of the harassment. It could be anonymous. It could be from a third party. So, you know, friend is telling you that she thinks her friend was harassed. It can be from anywhere and anyone. And it is just the very initial knowledge. It's your initial actual knowledge that something may have happened. All that triggers is your obligation to do something, anything, to sit down and talk with that person, to look into it. But it does not trigger a formal investigation process. What triggers a formal investigation process is a formal complaint. And that is when the person who is the complainant or their parent sits down and says, I want to file a formal complaint. I want to trigger an entire investigation. I want to go through the whole process. That is what is going to be much rarer under these new Title IX regulations. Because what's going to end up happening is, and we're going to go through this process with you, you're going to get a lot of reports. The reports won't change. You're going to hear about just as much sexual harassment next year as you did the year before. Those won't change. What is going to change, we think, is the amount of people who actually want to file a formal complaint, because they are such a burdensome investigation now, and so long, and requires so much due process and cross-examining now, that it is highly likely a complainant will say, I don't want to go through a formal complaint and I don't want to go through a formal investigation. So the report numbers won't change, but your formal complaint numbers will probably significantly diminish over the next couple of years. You go to the next slide, Julie. Our response to a report has to include offering supportive measures like the counseling or splitting kids up in class, things you do all the time anyway. And it has to include having the Title IX coordinator contact that complainant to discuss the availability of the supportive measures and to consider the complainant's wishes regarding whether or not they want to file a formal complaint. So basically we get some knowledge, we get some report of sexual harassment, sexual assault, something like that. What we have to do is we have to have the Title IX coordinator sit down with that person if possible. Sometimes they might be anonymous and you're not able to, but sit down with that person and say, okay, look, first of all, what can we do for you from a supportive measure standpoint, from what we used to call interim measures? And number two, let me walk you through what this process looks like if you want to file a formal complaint, and you get to decide whether or not you want to go forward with a formal complaint. You may very well not want to, but I'm obligated to walk you through what that process will look like. So that's how we have to respond to any report of sexual harassment, which is also why it's so important that your lower level staff know when they get a report, they have to get it up to that Title IX coordinator, because it automatically triggers Title IX coordinators' obligations when we get any report at any level in the school district. Okay, next slide. Now, if the person decides they don't want to have a formal complaint, the process ends, generally speaking. But again, there's an asterisk. If the person, the complainant, doesn't want to go through with it, but the Title IX coordinator does, the Title IX coordinator can sign off on a formal complaint on their own. So that would be, for example, if the decision not to investigate is clearly unreasonable, or if there is an ongoing concern about other alleged victims, or there's some sort of significant concerns or the involvement of an employee. I call this rule, when there's smoke, there's fire. So it's a person who comes to the school with a report. They say, I don't want to go through with the formal complaint, but the Title IX coordinator says, yeah, I don't care. We have to go through with a formal complaint. And the Title IX coordinator basically steps into the place of the complainant and signs off and says, we're going to do a formal complaint. At that point, then you could still have supportive measures for that complainant, even though they didn't want to go forward with it. It just kind of depends on the facts of the scenario. But generally speaking, if the complainant doesn't want to go forward, the regulations say everything stops at that point. It's meant to be rare that the Title IX coordinator does it on their own. Okay, next slide.
One practice pointer right there, Jess, before we transition, would be if we, thank you. if we don't have a complaint go forward, your bullet point that says supportive measures continue or discontinue at the Title IX coordinator's discretion. We don't know yet, folks. See, we still have 124 participants online. We don't know yet how this is going to play out with Office of Civil Rights and lawsuits with supportive measures, meaning when we're looked at to be deliberately indifferent. Remember those standards we talked to you about at the very beginning of the presentation? And so whether we as a school district or our Title IX coordinator, who more than likely is a school employee, we're deliberately indifferent. You know, there may be lawsuits to say, yeah, this didn't go forward to be a Title IX formal complaint, but yet there were never any supportive measures offered. This is going to be years in the making, as Jessica mentioned a moment ago, from 2 to 3 to 5 years from now, court cases that tell us, should we have offered something even though it didn't go forward? It was just, it ended at the report stage. So you may, again, in the toolbox idea and the paper trail idea, may, you know, we often work with schools and schools will say, well, we offered the parent this. Okay, well, show me where you offered them that in writing. And you'll hear that all the time from ISBA or from a law firm. So you may want to develop something here. If it doesn't proceed into a formal complaint and you're still offering supportive measures, or you did offer supportive measures, you may want to have something to paper trail that you did that, because when it turns into a lawsuit, we're going to be able to want to demonstrate what those were, at what timeline did we offer those.
Another note on that, but on the deliberately indifferent, some of the cases that have come out once that standard was set, I've dealt with issues where there was more than one incident, and then maybe one incident, like maybe incident number 2 was told to the principal or Title IX coordinator or whatever, and they addressed it, but then maybe it continued on. And so there was other complaints, and you know, the schools really didn't do, you know, maybe they did the same thing or didn't do anything different. And the school was sued for not continuing to address the issue in a different manner. And some courts have said that has been deliberately indifferent as well. So to Andrew's point, I think even though it doesn't go forward to a formal complaint, we kind of have this informal process of providing supportive measures, and maybe we do need to have some kind of procedure in place where we are kind of checking in every once in a while to see maybe the supportive measures are no longer needed, but we do kind of still need to check in to make sure everything's okay between the respondent and the complainant and there's not any more issues. Kind of keeping an eye on things type of situation. So keep that in mind too, that that deliberately indifferent doesn't necessarily end just because you did something once. Okay, it can continue if the situation continues or escalates.
I think we'll take it at, let me define in the next slide formal complaints after the Bernstein Bear slide. We'll go forward.
And we do have a question.
Oh, sure.
So I think it's appropriate to answer here because it's about reporting. A student reports inappropriate behavior that would be considered sexual harassment during school day to the administrator. The administrator should investigate inappropriate behavior as usual and immediately communicate report to Title IX coordinator, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
And again, this is a new standard, new process. So the Title IX coordinator is going to need to have that report to lay out for the complainant and the respondent if there's a next step into the formal complaint, which we're talking about right now. So formal complaints, and we'll take maybe a 5-minute or so pause after this section just to let you have a breather, let our presenters have a breather as well. So formal complaint is that new, very deliberative, specific, choreographed next stage that would be something that is filed in person by mail and is going to be to the Title IX coordinator. Without a formal complaint, no investigation goes forward. So again, these are dance steps. These are choreographed steps that have to be specific. Again, for purposes of receiving reports or taking the next step to a formal complaint, I think all our assistant principals, counselors, principals, athletic directors are going to need this training at some point. So we must then initiate the grievance process if the complainant decides to make a formal complaint. In the regulations, you often see grievance process, investigation, formal complaint used interchangeably, and just be ready for spotting that that means we're going to the next step. Features. There's a strong due process protection for the complainant, although you've heard us several times today say there's also strong due process for the respondent. A non-student employee can be placed on administrative leave during the investigation, the grievance process. There is no specific timeline for filing the complaint, except that at the time of the filing of the complainant must be participating or attempting to participate in the school education program or activity. Jessica has mentioned this earlier. They have to be enrolled or participating in the school activity. Signing a formal complaint does not mean a Title IX coordinator becomes a party to a grievance. Again, practice pointer, we have seen over the past couple of years that respondents, meaning those who allegedly did the harassing or the assault or whatever, are starting to bring lawsuits themselves under the special education due process umbrella. We've had a special needs student with an emotional disability bring a lawsuit. So keep in mind that is another avenue. Next. Formal complaint, confidentiality.
Is that you want me to step in or are you good?
This one so I can get not choked up for something.
Okay. Formal complaint confidentiality. The regulations say that schools have to keep confidential the identity of any individual who's made a report, any complainant, as well as any individual who has been reported to be the perpetrator of sexual discrimination. Now, this gets a little funky because the regulations are clear about confidentiality. However, they have another little asterisk caveat loophole, which is to say that you will keep these things confidential but accepting that if you have to carry out an investigation, including the grievance process, then confidentiality goes out the window. So the line that we have tried to make under these confusing regulations is that if a report is made, absolutely things can be kept confidential. If a person comes to you with a report, but they don't want to move forward with a formal complaint, it's easy to keep those things confidential. You can separate students. You can provide counseling to the complainant. We can work with confidentiality in that situation. However, the triggering of a formal complaint will necessarily mean that confidentiality is greatly jeopardized. There is no way under the obligations of the Title IX grievance process and the investigation process that you can keep confidential the identity of the parties from one another. We throw these regulations up here on the slide because that's exactly what the regulations say, but keep in mind, confidentiality is very much in jeopardy and will likely never be confidential if you actually go through a formal complaint process. Andrew, have you recovered?
Okay,
Yeah.
so report can be anonymous. I just started mentioning that.
Andrew, I lost your sound. Are we good? We're good.
Okay, I think silent for a second. report itself can be anonymous. A formal complaint cannot. This is what we were just talking about, unless the identity of the complaint is unknown. And so keep that in mind, that as they proceed. I don't think that this would be something to use as a deterrent, but we certainly would want to make people, respondents, complainants aware that if they go forward with the complaint process, it's possible that their identity is going to be known through the grievance process. All right, next one. Okay.
And on that note, just as we were talking about earlier, I think that's why we're going to see fewer formal complaints, because I think the victim is not going to want to be to go through this if there's any possibility of that person's identity being known. To the extent we can, we'll keep it confidential. But yeah, because of some of the issues because of some of the procedures that we'll get into later, it is almost going to be nearly impossible. But I think that's why we'll see a lot of the formal complaints go down because of that issue.
Okay, next slide. Presumption of non-responsibility. We mentioned this earlier. New requirement derives from fundamental concept of fairness. Process must include a presumption the respondent is not responsible for the alleged conduct. So again, we see that the changes in administration from Obama to Trump, and it is what it is. This is a part of this regulation. Depending on the election, we may be changing back again in the future. So we'll see. It is interesting again that Title IX especially is impacted by an administration change when several other laws that we hoped that would be changed under schools stay the same. But presumption of non-responsibility. Go forward. Rationale for the presumption. I kind of mentioned this. Mitigate perception that respondents are responsible. Restore the public confidence in Title IX. Has nothing to do with respondents' credibility. Credibility determination should not be based on a party status as a complainant or respondent. Last couple of slides here. The written notice of allegations must be issued upon receipt of a formal complaint. So again, as you go through this process, the complainant, respondent, their family, their representative need to understand that we're going to have formal allegations. They're going to be in writing. There is more due process to this. It must be sent to all known parties. And it must be sent regardless of any concurrent law enforcement investigation. They have told us from the Office of Civil Rights that they do not want this to be delayed. If somebody files a formal complaint, you move it forward with the process of notifying the parties.
Andrew, can I just interrupt you for a second to let everybody know? Andrew's going to walk through here the detailed steps of the grievance process. So someone says they want a formal complaint, they want a formal investigation, here's the steps you're going to take. And then right after our break, I'm going to provide you with a flow chart that gives you this in step-by-step summary. So I would just ask if you have any questions about these steps, reserve them for a minute, because we're going to give you the details and then we're going to summarize it in a easier soundbite.
And I just want to interject here. A lot of these new procedures and the presumption of innocence, for lack of a better word, or non-responsibility, and some of these other new items that we've seen in the regulations really come out of about 3 or 4 cases at the college level, where the respondent, who was male, did not feel the process the college went through were fair to him, and that they got their due process. There was 2 or 3 cases. I think one was out of Michigan, a couple other places around the Midwest. So I think some of these formalized processes really are a result of those cases. And I think the OCR really struggled with, we're really focused on that, and then a lot of the complaints about that were, well, wait a minute, secondary and elementary students, schools don't need to go through all this. We haven't been doing all these things that have happened at at the college level. Also, the college level, they want, the right to confront, to cross-examine. Well, we've never really had that at the elementary and secondary levels. So they did make some exceptions to that to the process for the elementary and secondary schools, which Andy will go through. But I just want to point out, that's why we're seeing some of these more onerous procedures, because it's really based on some of those cases out of the colleges and not elementary and secondary.
Good point. All right, I'll go through these a little bit quickly because we're going to summarize it all together when we come back. So the information about the school's grievance process, a copy of our link and our policy is going to be in that notice, along with, again, the assumption or presumption of non-responsibility by the respondent. Next, the notice of the allegations have to have sufficient detail. We've brainstormed in our office and talking with Julie and Lisa. If you don't get sufficient detail as the Title IX coordinator, does that mean there's a dismissal? Because it's supposed to have the identities, the conduct, and the date and location all as part of the written notice of the complaint. So I don't know the answer to that. Going to be one of those two that we're still exploring.
I think that's one of the things that maybe is going to be decided by the court, or OCR may come out with future guidance on that. So I don't want to say don't do it, just because we do have an obligation to investigate once a formal complaint is filed, but it will be more difficult, obviously, to investigate when we don't have this information.
Next, they are then allowed to have an advisor who may be, but is not required to be, an attorney. Some of you that have expulsion examiners and policies on not allowing attorneys in rooms. Yeah, I'm not, I mean,
for this purpose.
for Title IX purposes, this may be something that they are allowed to have an attorney. It has a written notice of any provision of the school's code of conduct that prohibits knowingly making false statements and giving information during the investigation. Next, information about retaliation and information about supportive measures, information about the investigative process, and information about where to direct questions. All of that has to be in, again, is prescriptive here, that you have to have that in the notice that goes out of the formal complaint. All right, rounding this out here. If in the course of an investigation, there are additional allegations, which does happen, that there's additional information or allegations, hey, something else gets reported as an additional incident, you have to then let people know that you're going to be adding that as an additional allegation if that happens. Next. Okay, we talked about dismissal. When must a formal complaint be dismissed? If the conduct alleged in the formal complaint would not constitute sexual harassment. So the only example I can think of that we've talked about a little bit today, maybe the student walking down the hallway, he slaps the behind of the other student. There's maybe an admission by the complainant that it was done in fun or it was done in, back and forth banter. Then it's not done for sexual gratification. It wouldn't meet the definition of sexual harassment. If the conduct did not occur in the school's education program or activity, if the conduct did not occur against a person in the United States. Jess, I think you alluded to this earlier, right, with field trips or out of country. Dismissal of a formal complaint under a school's Title IX procedures does not preclude action under another provision of the Code of Conduct. We've said this several times today. So a school could still go forward with another type of bullying, discipline, and remember that you can still provide supportive measures. Start using that supportive measures as a term of art for going forward. Permissive dismissal. If a complainant notifies the Title IX coordinator that they're withdrawing the complaint, and that would be a permissive dismissal, or the Title IX coordinator could proceed. If the respondent is no longer enrolled, we talked about this, consider whether the respondent poses an ongoing risk. So if you've got a serial harasser and the complainant has withdrawn from the school district, maybe you still, as the Title IX coordinator, want to proceed making a determination. Finally, if the specific circumstances prevent the recipient from gathering evidence sufficient to reach a determination as to the formal complaint, those would all be permissive, discretionary ways to dismiss the complaint. So before we get in, last one, I guess. Before we get into the grievance process, what happens if upon dismissal, the school must promptly send a written notice of the dismissal and the reasons for it to the parties, and then there's a right of appeal that can happen upon a dismissal. I think this is a little bit similar to what we talked about, where there are similar allegations, that last one, consolidation of formal complaints that arise out of the same facts or circumstances. It could be multiple complainants, it could be multiple respondents. So you could consolidate a investigation of a formal complaint or complaints into one set of investigations. So keep that in mind. If there's an incident that involves multiple complainants or respondents, we could consolidate it into one. I think we'll take a 5-minute pause. Before we do that, any questions about the very, prescribed specific way to file a formal complaint? Obviously, you're going to have new paperwork forms to go along with a filing of complaint. Jessica or Julie, anything before we take just a 5-minute?
And
All right.
right now, I do not see any questions, but we may have some other for you.
We're going to come back and go into more detail about what has to happen then during the investigation of the grievance process and what the burden of proof is. So I would say we're at 2:32, about 2:37. We'll be back at 2:37. Put us on mute.
Scott? Testing, testing, testing.
All right, we back on? Okay, Jessica's going to introduce our transition slide here.
Oh, Dr. Fauci. By the way, these are all not copyrighted, so don't give any, we're giving credit to the original artist for sure. I'm not having a copyright violation while I'm doing fun COVID children's books. All right, so Andrew started us off on the grievance process with the formal complaint filing. I'm going to walk us through what you have to do next, okay? So first of all, there was a question earlier about evidentiary standards and burdens of proof. The regulations are clear that the burden of proof rests on the school, not on the parties, and that we have to maintain objectivity and impartiality. Next slide. I'm going to get into records here in a minute. It also states that there cannot be any conflicts of interest. Now, there are perceived conflicts of interest that are much more common, and there are actual legal conflicts of interest that usually don't happen very often. Obviously, a person who is named as the alleged harasser or as a witness cannot be a member of the investigatory team. That should be a very obvious statement to you all. But also, this is more of a perceived conflict. If a district level administrator, board member, or Title IX coordinator is named as the harasser or a witness, it's a good idea just to call in an outside investigator at that point. Even if one of those people is not necessarily a member of the investigatory team, just for a perceived conflict of interest, call in an outside attorney, call in an outside superintendent who's trained, call ISBA, get somebody else to run the entire investigation so that you just aren't prone to conflicts of interest allegations at the end of the day. Okay, next
Jessica,
slide.
on that, I think we talked about this a few days ago as well. I think some corporations are talking about kind of coordinating these efforts and then maybe having, they'll each obviously have their own Title IX coordinator, but like School Corporation A, if they get a formal complaint, they may have someone from School Corporation B be their investigator or decision maker or something. And you want to expand upon that a little bit? Do you think that's okay?
Yeah, let's talk about it a little bit now, and then we'll talk about it in the flow chart too. This idea, I will not take credit for it. It actually came from Wayne County, where several of the smaller school districts basically said, look, can we rely upon each other since we know everybody's trained and we have good Title IX coordinators? Can we rely upon each other when we need to call in an outside investigator or when we need to have somebody act as an appellate body? And we looked through the regulations and that makes total sense. So think about neighboring districts when you think about an outside investigator. But also we're going to talk about the appeal process and how you could use neighboring districts as well if you know that that person has been appropriately trained under Title IX. All right, there are no limits on how many witnesses a party could bring and other evidence that a party could bring, except for relevancy. So if the party, either the respondent or the complainant, wants to bring evidence, wants to bring witnesses, or wants to be able to discuss the allegations and present and gather evidence, there is no limit on that, which is a pretty broad obligation on the school to listen and consider anything that that person thinks might be relevant. Now, it does not apply to the discussion of information, not the allegations under investigation. So for example, you can determine relevancy. If you think that they're bringing something that is not relevant to the allegations under the investigation, you can throw that out. It also doesn't apply if somebody doesn't file a formal complaint. This is only under the formal complaint investigation process. And it does not limit your ability to restrict the parties from contacting each other. So just because a party can bring evidence to the school's attention does not mean that that party is allowed to harass or confront or contact the victim of sexual harassment. It's just a matter of how much evidence can the respondent or the complainant bring to the Title IX investigator in order to prove their side of the story.
Jessica, we have a few questions.
Oh, yeah.
They kind of fit in here at this time. Just the difference between a criminal standard and the school standard.
I'll get into that in a second.
Yeah, that was a few slides ago. Because some schools get caught up between reasonable doubt and reasonable suspicion.
I'll get into that.
And then what qualifications are needed to be a Title IX coordinator? Does it need to be a central office person?
Qualifications for Title IX coordinator, they need to go through this for sure. Other than that, there are not a lot of official Title IX coordinator obligations. Generally speaking, they need to be a central office staff. A lot of times it does fall to the superintendent or assistant superintendent. However, having a principal do it or a building level administrator or a counselor is perfectly fine. It's more about how are they trained, not what title do they hold.
And so here's the burden of proof.
Oh, here we go. Well,
That's
no,
a different.
keep going forward.
Next one.
We're going to get into evidentiary standards. Yeah, here, perfect. This will answer Mike's questions. Under the new regulations, the schools have the discretion to choose which standard of evidence you will rely upon to determine whether or not sexual harassment occurred. You can either choose the preponderance of the evidence standard or the clear and convincing evidence standard. So the preponderance of the evidence standard is basically, it's more likely than not that it happened. That's kind of your 51% standard. Or a clear and convincing evidence standard is obviously a much higher bar. And that would be a standard of, the evidence demonstrates it is clear and convincing that sexual harassment did or did not occur. Now, you need to check your CBA because sometimes this is defined about complaints versus employees. And this can be the standard that you only use for Title IX. It doesn't have to be the standard you use for all sorts of investigations. So for example, like an investigation into racial discrimination or disability discrimination might be handled differently. But you have to decide now for Title IX if you're going to use a preponderance of the evidence standard or a clear and convincing evidence standard. And these are the standards to determine at the end of an investigation whether or not something happened. It is not the standard to start an investigation. You start an investigation when the complainant tells you to start an investigation. If somebody files a formal complaint, you have to go through the investigation process and the grievance process, and you have to maintain objectivity and impartiality until the very end of that. I'll give you an example right now. We're going through a Title IX investigation at a school, and we have done, I don't know, 20 different interviews with people and looked through 20 different types of documentation over the course of 6 weeks. And up until the very last moment, we had not decided whether or not sexual harassment was substantiated or not based on a preponderance of the evidence standard. You go through that whole investigation without thinking about, is this really happened or not? It's at the very end where you take all the information you've gathered and you said, okay, based on my either 51% standard or my clear and convincing evidence standard, do I think that sexual harassment was substantiated here or not? And that's something that you will have to define for your district, and it will differ district to district. Our standards and our model procedures use the preponderance of the evidence standard. It's an easier standard to go by. It's more of a gut instinct. It's more of a, is it more than likely that it happened? When you stack all the information up together, which way does it lean? And it happens to be just an easier standard to apply. Okay, next slide.
All right, Jessica, listening to you, paying attention to.
Thanks, Julie. All right, regulations deem that certain information will not be relevant to the grievance process. So when you are gathering information, you're gathering witness testimony, these things are not relevant. Information that's protected by a legally recognized privilege. So for example, attorney-client privilege, doctor-patient privilege, counselor-patient privilege, anything that has a legally recognized privilege and the person doesn't want to bring it up, then it's not relevant to the information. If they do want to bring it up, maybe you have a complainant who says, look, this has been so bad, I've had to have counseling for a year, and I want to show you my counselor notes. I want to show you my counselor receipts to prove to you how much this has affected me. In that case, that's fine. They've waived the privilege and they've brought it forward and it's relevant. But otherwise, you can't deem that it's relevant or irrelevant because it has been under a legally recognized privilege. They also deem that the complainant's prior sexual history is not relevant to the grievance process. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. And then the final bullet point already covers the medical information. Sorry, go ahead, Julie, you were right. All right, so evidence and questions about a complainant's sexual predisposition must always be deemed irrelevant, say the regulations, and therefore excluded. However, there are two limited exceptions. One, if the respondent, so the alleged harasser, contends that someone other than him or her committed the misconduct, or where the question or evidence concern incidents between the two and are offered to prove consent. So the only time that you can deem prior sexual history relevant are in one of those two exceptions, and it's generally to prove that A, somebody else did it, or B, yes, we did it, but we both were consenting to it. That's the only time you can bring up prior sexual history.
Jessica, when I read the regs, I was trying to rack my brain of a situation where number one would apply. Why would you need the sexual history of the complainant to prove the respondent? You guys thought about that?
A little bit. The situation that we thought it would most likely apply in was mostly post-secondary, and it would usually be something to the effect of, this is where it gets a little weird. Like there were more than one person, there were more than two people in the room. Thanks for giving me the really sexually awkward question though, Julie. I really appreciate that.
Sorry, Jessica. I was when I read that through the regs, I was just like, what? When would this apply? So
Yeah, that was the only situation we could come up with where it applied.
and that makes sense.
Very post-secondary. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna try to get the redness out of my cheeks and I'll keep going. Parties might be accompanied to any related proceeding or meeting by an advisor of their choice, who may be but is not required to be an attorney. Andrew touched on this earlier. It could also just be their parent or a advocate or a friend. It's just a matter of they're allowed to have somebody with them. You cannot limit the choice or presence of an advisor for either party, but you could establish restrictions regarding the extent to which they could participate, as long as those restrictions apply equally to both parties. So for example, you know, you're allowed to ask questions of you're allowed to ask questions of the investigator, but you know, we're going to limit you if you start to get out of control. We're going to ask you to leave the room, that kind of thing. All right, next slide. Single investigatory model is prohibited. This is where I'm going to talk in the flow chart. This is where you have to have 3 separate people when you are talking about a Title IX investigation, because the regulations say that the person who does the investigating, which is usually your Title IX coordinator delegating to other people, cannot be the decision maker who issues the final decision. And then that people cannot be the appeal person. So when you're thinking about how to do a Title IX investigation, your Title IX coordinator does not have to be the investigator. They usually are. They are usually the person at the center who is delegating everything, making sure people are doing the right questions. They might be the person who does the entire investigation. They also might be the person that tells the assistant principal to go do a witness testimony and then get back to me. But they cannot be the ultimate decision maker. And you'll see in our flow chart, we have suggested that your Title IX coordinator be your investigator, your ultimate decision maker be your superintendent, because that's the person who's going to ultimately decide if somebody needs to be expelled, if a teacher's contract needs to be canceled. They're the ones who make the ultimate decision. So you really need that to be the person who's at the top of the chain. All right, so a lot of this pieces you know, but we're going to go through them quickly. What are some of the steps of the investigation process? What are your Title IX coordinator going to do? They're going to interview the complainant first. That is always, always, always your first stop. You have to talk to the person who made the complaint first. And it needs to be a full sit-down interview with them about what happened, what the impact was on them, and have them identify witnesses. So you've got a whole bullet point list here of what that's going to look like. And then your second step, Julie, next slide, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your second step is going to be your other interviews. You're going to do your potential witnesses that are named by the complainant. You're going to ask the witnesses if they have other people that they want you to talk to. And then you're going to also remind everybody at the end that it's an open investigation, so they can come back to you with more questions, more information at any time. Next slide. And then of course, you are going to interview the respondent. Now, the order of when you interview the respondent and when you interview the other witnesses is really up to you. The most important part of the investigation is that the complainant comes first, and then everybody else can really come in whatever order you need them to come in. You do the respondent interview, ask them, of course, as well, if they have any witnesses that they want you to interview as well, and you'll interview the respondent's witnesses if you deem them relevant. Just because somebody says, I think you need to talk to X person, does not mean you have to talk to X person. You still, as the investigator, get to determine the relevancy of your investigation and the relevancy of the people that you need to interview and documents you need to review, but you at least ask what other names they have for you to look at. Okay, next slide.
Jessica, because we do have a few questions on the interview process, so I think this is a good time to ask them. One question is, can a school corporation use a panel of more than one individual to serve as a Title IX coordinator?
No, you cannot. You have to have a Title IX coordinator listed by the title of the person, not necessarily by the name of the person, but it has to be one specific person.
But Jess, you want to explain though, what does that mean though with respect to actually doing the investigation?
Well, that's a good point. So you can have a panel of people or delegate multiple people to conduct an investigation. So if you actually get into a grievance process and you're in the middle of one of these, they're huge. I mean, they're very burdensome. So your Title IX coordinator, that individual, could say, I want the principal to interview this person. I want the AP to interview this person. I want the other AP to look through all of these documents. I need help from my fellow building level administrator to do this. And you're going to bring all the information to me, and me as the investigator is going to look through everything. That is definitely permissible, but you cannot have more than one Title IX coordinator.
So you can have a panel of investigators, but only
Sure.
one Title IX coordinator.
Yep.
Well, and that kind of dovetails into the next one. Can or should all interviews be recorded? I mean, if you have a couple different investigators doing the interviews, that might be something you want to consider.
Yeah, I think I think that the recording of interviews is very fact dependent. I will tell you that, Andrew and I do these kind of investigations all the time. I can think of maybe twice I've ever actually recorded interviews. I typically don't. I typically have more than one person in the interview so that somebody can take very detailed notes. However, there are definitely situations where if it's a super litigious situation, if it's a super high profile situation, or if you have a lot of people who are helping you conduct the investigation, like Julie said, you could certainly record them. But generally speaking, I think it inflames tensions and makes people more nervous, and you get less forthright answers, generally. And then the other question was, is it permissible to interview the complainant without the presence of parents, guardians, et cetera? I'm actually going to tell you about in the written notice how you have to give the parents 5 days heads up before you interview anyone. That's a new requirement. So you're not permitted under Title IX to go straight in and start talking to the student about Title IX without the parents knowing ahead of time and without the parents being allowed to be there. However, asterisk again, that doesn't apply to your normal student code of conduct type investigations and interviews. So no, you can't just go straight into Title IX questions about the allegations without the parents knowing about it. However, if you find out about something and there's a student code of conduct issue, and you typically would call that student into the principal's office and start asking them questions right then and there, you would go through your normal procedures for that to make that as clear as mud.
Yeah, I think the nuance is that yes, we do have to give the parents notice, but what if the complainant doesn't want the parent present at the interview? Maybe they want another representative or whatever. Is that permissible? Do we have to let the parent and guardian in on the interview with the complainant?
I would say no. Andrew, what do you think?
No, I mean, it's, I would try to treat it like we would with a disciplinary expulsion matter as well. And if we've had some sort of precedent there, that's what we would do. If we let a parent in, student didn't want parent in, but I don't know anything that's in our material, our regs that would speak to that.
Right. I think the regs are silent on that. I guess I would, because of the complaining having the right to have a representative present, and that's not the parent, I would say it was okay, but that's the answer is not clear in the regs or even in our state policies. On the interview process, so Jessica, just another note on that. So let's say we have 10, 15 interviews, 2 or 3 different people are doing that. So once we record one interview, do we have to record all of them, or can we pick and choose? Or
That's a good point. I would do it consistently. So if I'm going to record one, I'm going to record them all. And that actually even applies to how you do the interview. So for example, in the example I just gave you of this 6-week, 20-person investigation we're doing, we started with Zoom interviews. We have made everybody do a Zoom interview from here on out, even those that could meet in person, because you just want to maintain that consistency to avoid the conflict of interest issue. So if you're going to do all in-person interviews, if you're going to do all Zoom interviews, if you're going to record them, if you're going to not record them, just maintain consistency throughout the investigation.
right. And the Title IX coordinator can be the person during the investigation.
Correct.
Okay, a few more here. The This is from Ron Cross, who's another attorney. It's a good question. In interviewing a respondent, must the interviewer provide garrity warnings? Do the regulations create any type of use immunity for the respondents in their testimony?
It's a good question. So garrity warnings of definitely for an employee who's involved. I'm going to talk a little bit about non-disclosure agreements because there is a very big loophole and a very big FERPA problem with the interviews and with the evidence that's used, the notes from the interviews. So I'm going to hold on that for a second because we are going to get into non-disclosures. It's going to be a big deal.
Okay. You see the
and
question?
then-
I think we've got, you and I need to speak up a little bit.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to get into the 5-day parental notice. There's a question there about that. I'm going to talk about that. Is the Title IX coordinator by case or for the district totally? It's by the district totally. The Title IX coordinator has to be one person for the district at all times. And the decision maker can be the superintendent. Yes, we actually advise that the superintendent is your decision maker. If we choose to have an outside person on retainer as our Title IX coordinator, could that person also be the investigator? Ooh, well, number one, the regulations and the law, actually, not only the statute and the regulations, say that your Title IX coordinator needs to be for the district. So I'm not entirely sure what the fact pattern is on that. We'd have to talk about that. But you do have to pick a person in your district to be a Title IX coordinator. They have to have that title.
Be an employee, right?
An employee, yes. And can the coordinator investigate? Yes, your Title IX coordinator can be your investigator, should probably be your investigator, but they also have the ability to delegate the investigative work, especially if it's very burdensome, to other lower level administrators or teach or whoever. But your Title IX coordinator is going to be the person who they are well trained in Title IX. They understand what Title IX means. They understand what the grievance procedure means, and they can certainly delegate to other people to get the investigation done, but they are your primary person to answer questions. Okay, let's go forward here because I think we're going to get into the flow chart and that'll help answer a lot of questions. We've already gone through this slide, other interviews that need done. You're going to review records and evidence. I can't tell you how many times we've done these investigations, and by the time the attorneys get called in, somebody will tell me, well, you know, we've talked to both kids and we've talked to one of the witnesses, so we're done. And my question is, well, have you looked at grades? Have you looked at attendance? Have you looked at video records? Have you looked at any sort of emails that are made about this? And I get kind of a blank stare. But think very carefully about this. If a student says, I've been sexually harassed and I can't even concentrate in math class anymore sitting next to this other student because he sexually harassed me, I'm going to go and look at your math grades. I'm going to go talk to your math teacher. If you say that, you know, you're not able to focus and you're not able to turn in assignments, but you've turned in every assignment and you have straight A's and you've always had straight A's, it's hard to make that connection that it's affected you in your educational program and activity. So it's just a warning here of when you're talking about a full-blown investigation, you're not just talking about witness interviews. You're talking about a review of all sorts of documentation and data and checking personnel and student files to see what's going on here and do I have any sort of evidence that helps lean me one way or the other. Okay, next slide. And then you analyze the evidence, credibility decisions based on history of similar conduct, bias, eye contact, voice, demeanor during interviews, and then you determine if it's substantiated. And that's where your preponderance of the evidence standard or your clear and convincing evidence standard comes into play. You take everything that you know, you put it all together, and you apply it to your policy and say, all right, based on the preponderance of the evidence, is it more likely than not that it's substantiated sexual harassment or not? Okay, next slide. You have to then, okay, I'm gonna pause here for a second because you're gonna hate me when I say this. And everyone's gonna freak out, and I'm just warning you, you're gonna freak out for a minute. It's gonna sound crazy. But under the new regulations, you take all the evidence you've gathered, your witness testimony notes, your student files, your personnel files, and you have to provide all of that evidence, every piece of it, to both parties. And they have 10 days to respond to all of the evidence. Now, the evidence has to be directly related to the allegations, so you can eliminate the evidence that is not about the allegations. But if it has anything to do with this complaint, you have to provide it to both parties, and you have to redact information that might not be related, and confidential information may not be redacted if it is directly related to the allegations. This is where you're going to find complainants not wanting to go forward, because basically what happens is every piece of evidence that you gather on a sexual harassment thing is going to go to the other party, and they have an opportunity then to respond to it.
Jessica, I think when we get into the flow chart again, a lot of this will all come together. But to Jessica's point, you may have somebody that is adamant, a complainant that is adamant they're going to go forward with a formal complaint. You may then, as the investigator, want to hold a phone call with the parties and explain in a miniature version all of these procedures, including that everything is going to be shared with both parties. Now, again, we don't want to have roadblocks and deterrents to people filing formal complaints. They may file it, then you may do a discussion with both parties about what this slide says, and then there's a thing called informal resolution, which Jess is going to get here in a minute in the flow chart.
Okay, next slide. I think here's where we talk about non-disclosure. Okay, so you're probably reeling right now thinking, if I'm going to turn over all this evidence to the other party, I'm violating FERPA. It's private information, it's student confidential information. So what the next step is going to have to be is a contract, a non-disclosure agreement that both parties sign to promise that they will not share this information beyond themselves and for the scope of just this investigation. Now, this is all new territory. No one's had to do this before, so we're not entirely sure how it works. But what we suggest is, and what we have in our toolkit, is a sample non-disclosure agreement where before the sharing of the evidence, both parties sign a contract saying, I will not share it any further than this. And if they do, it spells out the consequences for that. And if a party refuses to sign the non-disclosure agreement, they do not get the evidence, which basically really hinders them from participating in the investigation. But it's kind of a pay-to-play thing. If you're not going to guarantee us that this information stays with you, then you don't get the information. Go ahead.
What if they refuse to sign it?
Then they don't get the evidence.
What you have to exchange evidence with both parties to go forward.
The regulations say you can use non-disclosure agreements. So we're taking the stance right now, but like I said, no one's had to do this yet, and it might very well get litigated in court, that we're taking the stance right now that if you don't sign the non-disclosure agreement, you don't get the evidence. Because if we do give you the evidence, we've now violated FERPA. So we have to choose between violating Title IX and violating FERPA. And in the long run, I'm going to choose to protect student privacy more so than I'm going to choose to make sure you get due process out of Title IX. Because in the long run, your participation in the Title IX investigation and your ability to get due process through your Title IX investigation is going to be dependent upon us making sure that we maintain privacy as much as possible.
So the question that came up, does the side who signs it get the information?
Yes, I would say yes.
So Jessica, do we do this at the beginning of the investigation so that they all know that?
I think you have to certainly, when you're walking through the process and in the written notice that you'll give people, I think you certainly have to say ahead of time, you will sign a non-disclosure agreement or you will not participate. I don't think you need to go to a non-disclosure agreement signature until it's the evidence exchange piece. You could certainly just do it up front and say you're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement. But it's going to have to be, we're going to have to play this out as it goes. And I'm certain it's going to get litigated at some point, but the regulations have really stuck us between a rock and a hard place. And we've got to figure out how to protect this data while also giving due process to the respondent.
So are we going to see some changes in FERPA regs that say an agreement to participate in a formal complaint process under Title IX is consent to release the records?
Maybe.
Or was that what OCR was thinking?
Yeah, I don't think the regulations do mention the availability of a non-disclosure agreement. So somebody at least thought this is a problem. But again, these are really, I think Julie made the point earlier, these were really written for post-secondary. They were really thinking about the two students having a live hearing where there was an exchange of evidence and cross-examinations and almost a full-blown trial. So to do it in a K through 12 setting, somebody really didn't think through the whole FERPA and exchange of evidence piece of this. Question, what do you recommend then on telling those you interview that you have to share the info with both parties at the end of the investigation? We certainly do. You're going to tell both parties at the beginning that you are going to have to exchange information. They're going to know that going into it. Your written notice is going to tell them that this exchange will happen, which is also why we think a lot of complainants won't go forward with the formal process, because once they know that, they're not going to want to start down this path. Yes, I would also tell the witnesses that they're going to have that information exchanged as well. That's a good question, Reed. Thank you for clarifying. I think you also have to tell the witnesses as well that those notes will be exchanged with both parties. And again, that's going to have a chilling effect on witness testimony as well, because you can maintain confidentiality as much as possible, but when you have to turn over all of that evidence, people are going to know who you're talking about. All right, I'm going to tick people off more with the next slide too. Not only do you have to exchange all of the evidence with both parties, then the investigator, so in most cases, just your Title IX coordinator, is going to prepare a report that summarizes the relevant evidence. And they are going to, at least 10 days prior to a hearing, if a hearing is required, that's not required in K through 12. But 10 days prior to a final determination, they are going to send the report to each party. And that party gets to review and give a written response to that report. So now, not only are you giving both parties all evidence, and they get to give you feedback on the evidence, you are also giving them your draft report, and they get to give you feedback on your draft report. So for example, they might say, there was evidence here that you did not include in your draft report, or you didn't give enough credence to it in your draft report, and therefore I think your report is wrong. Or I saw in your written notes from your witness testimony that Juan said X, Y, and Z, but you didn't include that in your final report because you didn't think it was relevant. I think it's very relevant that Juan said X, Y, Z. I want you to include that in the final report. The parties now have a ton of feedback into what the school produces. And that is brand new under the regulations. Under old regulations, it was rare for the parties to ever see a final report. You just told them whether or not sexual harassment was substantiated or not and what the discipline was, if appropriate. Now they have access to everything, and they have the ability to give you feedback on what you've done wrong at every part of that stage too. I'm sorry. Nope, go one forward.
Never mind. I think you're going to answer it in the next couple slides.
Okay. Issues of relevance, any evidence that has any tendency to make a fact of consequence, to make the determination that sexual harassment is more or less probable than it would be without the evidence should be included. This is going to be on your Title IX coordinator, and usually with the advice of counsel too. At this point, you're looking for something that's probative, but you don't have to include all of the evidence in your final report. It's only things that you think make it more or less likely that sexual harassment is substantiated. Go ahead. Okay, so the example here is a defendant in a bank robbery case was overheard saying he wanted to rob a bank. Okay, yes, that's obviously probative. Human experience tells us when somebody says they're going to do something, they're more likely to do it. I would throw that into my final investigation report, obviously. But the party who said it might tell you, I don't think that's relevant. And you get to, the Title IX coordinator makes that ultimate determination. Just because the party gives you feedback on what they think is relevant or what evidence you included or not included does not mean you have to adopt what that party says. The Title IX coordinator is still the ultimate investigator and still makes the ultimate determination on relevancy. But the party just is allowed to give you feedback. Here's the other thing that's going to tick everybody off. Andrew, why do I have all the slides that are going to tick people off? Submission of written questions. So you have now given all of the evidence to both parties. You have now given your draft investigation report to both parties. They are able to give you all their feedback. Now, the decision maker, so generally speaking, your superintendent, has to afford both parties the opportunity to submit written relevant questions that the party once asked of any party or witness, and then to provide each party with the answers, and then allow for additional limited follow-up questions from each party. So what I want you to think about this is, in the post-secondary standpoint, this is a hearing. This is a live hearing. There is a judge, for lack of a better term. There are both parties. There are their advisors or their attorneys, and they literally have a trial. It is, you ask questions, you cross-examine, you can bring witnesses and cross-examine witnesses. It all happens live in the post-secondary frame. So they tried to make this apply to K through 12 without having a live hearing between high school kids. So now it's all in writing. And basically the decision maker or the superintendent acts as the judge, for lack of a better term, and he or she allows both parties to submit written questions. They exchange them to the other party or the other witness. They give the answers back, and they allow limited follow-up questions. Now on the next slide, there's some examples of how you can limit this. You have the discretion to set reasonable limits. Nobody has the power to compel witness participation. So if a party says, I really want you to go back and ask a witness these questions, if the witness doesn't want to, they don't have to. And you also have the ability to set the decorum for the written questions, and to only pose relevant questions. So if one of the parties gives you a list of 100 questions that they want asked of the other party, the decision maker, the superintendent, has the ability to strike some of those out. They can say, look, I'm only asking relevant questions. And if you're going to ask questions that include profanity or questions about past sexual experience or, kind of like slut shaming questions, those kind of things, I'm going to cross them all out. So you do have some ability to have some power over those questions. But in general, you're kind of acting like this middleman between two parties who are submitting written questions to each other. It's very burdensome. You can have an optional hearing if you want. I don't know any district that's doing this in the K through 12 situation, but that's why it exists in the post-secondary and why you're doing these written questions in K through 12 is because you're doing a substitution for a live hearing. All right, Then, after all this is over, and you've done the written questions, and you've done the exchange of information, the decision maker has the ultimate determination. And the ultimate determination has to include these bullet points. It has to include the description of the procedure, the findings of fact, the conclusions. Was sexual harassment, did it happen or not? And then a determination for responsibility and any disciplinary sanctions that are going to occur, which is why you want your superintendent to be your decision maker, because this is the person who's going to decide, is a student getting expelled? Is a teacher getting canceled their contract? This is the person who's going to be ultimately responsible for those disciplinary sanctions. And then your ultimate determination also has to include the bases and the procedures for anyone to appeal the decision, because after you've gone through all this process, the person who doesn't like the outcome can still appeal the outcome. And the other new fun part of these regulations is that you have to retain all Title IX investigation records for 7 years. This includes any sort of investigation, any appeal and results, informal resolution, which I'm going to talk about here in a second, training materials like this one you're going through right now, and supportive measures. And I can't remember if it was Julie or Andrew pointed this out earlier. Your supportive measures and your responses to your reports, that's not even a formal complaint. That's just when somebody comes in and says, I feel uncomfortable, it's sexual harassment. Okay, we're going to get you some counseling. Great. You don't want to go any further? No big deal. You're going to do a counseling and we're going to separate you from the other student. You still have to keep a written record of that for 7 years. So not only does it help you from a liability perspective, because when they come back and sue you and say, nobody gave me any supportive measures, you can be able to say, yes, we did. Here's the documentation of it. You're also obligated under these new regulations to keep it for 7 years anyway. So it's going to be very essential that your Title IX coordinator at your district knows what kind of records to keep, and there's some sort of continuity there. Even if it's just a Google Doc that is central to your district, and it's a running ongoing list so that if your Title IX coordinator changes, you still have the list of all of the documentation. But you're going to need a good system for record retention here, because it's a very burdensome 7-year project.
Jessica, we have a couple of questions. Well, one I think you're going to answer in a moment, but one is the impact. What impact does the feedback from parties have on the report? I think you did touch on that a little bit. Basically, the investigator does not have to put that in the report, correct?
Correct.
And then are you still going to get to the 5-day parental?
Yep. I'm going to talk about 5 days in the flow chart. Yep.
Okay, all right, great.
I just wanted to tick everybody off for a while first.
Sure.
Yeah. Just the messenger.
Always fun to be the messenger, isn't it?
Yeah. All right. So then we have to have an appeal process. You are forced to have an appeal if one of these 3 things has happened. Number 1, if there was some sort of procedural irregularity that affected the outcome of the matter. And that's essentially we didn't follow our own procedures. Number 2, if there's some sort of new evidence that wasn't available at the time that the determination was made. And number 3, if the Title IX coordinator, who's usually your investigator, your decision maker, who's usually your superintendent, had some sort of conflict of interest or bias against one of the parties that may have affected the outcome of the matter. And again, that's why at the beginning we said, look, if you think you have a conflict of interest, if it looks like a conflict of interest, just get somebody else to run the investigation. Because if not, you have a mandated appeal at the end of this. Okay, go ahead. All right, so the informal process, we think is going to be much, much, much more important because we think it's going to be much more used. But there are not a lot of regulations about the informal process. The only thing we know about the informal resolution process is that it's kind of like a mediation or a restorative justice format. And if both parties want to go through it, instead of this formal grievance process with exchange of evidence and witness testimony and non-disclosure agreements and all of this fun stuff. They can instead just go through an informal process that looks a lot more like mediation. Next slide. It can be offered at any time. So once a formal complaint has been filed, you can bring up, hey, do you want to just do informal resolution instead? It will be included in your written notice. So it will tell people again that they have the opportunity to do informal resolution. And it's available if both parties provide voluntary written consent to the process. Everybody has to sign off that they're okay with it. It's not available in any sort of employee or student case. So obviously that power dynamic means you can't have mediation. And really at any time they want to just go to informal, they can go to informal. They don't have to, it doesn't have to be a situation where you didn't say it in the beginning, so now we're halfway through this and you've changed your mind. It's okay to change your mind. We can go to informal at any point.
So the informal resolution process will be included in the initial written notice.
Yes.
Way back, that we talked about way back at the beginning of the process. This
Yes.
will be included in that.
Okay, informal resolution facilitators have to receive training on sexual harassment, scope, how to serve impartially, etc. And if they want to have witnesses during this, they can. But generally speaking, this looks a lot more like your day-to-day student resolution type things. It's your principal, maybe your Title IX coordinator sitting down with both kids and saying, how are we going to, move forward from this? Go ahead. Some people raised concerns about the idea of voluntary consent and making sure that both parties really signed off on it. That's why you're also going to make sure it's put in the written notice to both parties so that they fully understand what they're agreeing to in that informal resolution process. Go ahead. All right, now we're going to bring it all together in a flow chart and answer every question you've ever had about Title IX. So before we start this process, I just want to remind you that all of the deadlines we have in here are instructional or school days. You heard Andrew say earlier that the definitions and the regulation don't tell us what day means. So we have prescribed in here school days. If you see an asterisk in this flow chart, it means that it's not a mandated thing, it's just a suggestion. So we have dove through all these regulations and said, okay, where a regulation tells you you have to do something, we put it in there. When a regulation gave you a suggestion or here's where we think best practices are, that's where you're gonna note the asterisk. And then you're gonna note that we have 3 different people. You have your investigator, who we've suggested is your Title IX coordinator. They lead the investigation and use building level administrators where needed. They are also responsible for communicating with both parties. They're your go-to middleman. Then you have your decision maker, who's your superintendent. That's the person who's going to make your ultimate disciplinary decision. And then you have to have a 3rd appeal person. We have suggested here, it is not mandatory, that this is 1 school board member. The reason we've suggested that is because if a Title IX complaint results in a teacher being canceled, a teacher contract being canceled, or a student being expelled, that might go to the whole board in an appeal. Your teacher contract cancellation process might need to go to the whole board as an appeal. You don't want your whole school board tainted with knowledge of the Title IX investigation process when they get to the teacher contract cancellation process, if the 2 are involved. So when generally speaking, when you think of an appeal process, for teacher contract cancellation or for student expulsion, you think of the whole school board being over the superintendent for appeal processes. In this case, you don't want the whole school board. You want to keep some people blind to what's happened thus far. So you could do 1 school board member who could rotate depending on who's available. You could also, like we mentioned earlier, you could pick a neighboring district's Title IX coordinator or superintendent. You could pick somebody else from a neighbor who's well-trained, or you could pick counsel. A lot of times this is where the attorney comes in place and we come in and do the appeal process for you. So those are the 3 we've kind of suggested, but all you really have to do is have 3 separate people. That's it. And you can figure out what your appeal process looks like because it'll be so rare when it happens. All right, so here's our flow chart. First step at the top, you get your report. You have actual knowledge of an alleged Title IX violation. Anybody in your district gets it, and they have the report. The Title IX coordinator then has their initial response. So they contact the complainant, the alleged victim, within, we have suggested here, 2 school days to discuss supportive measures, to discuss if the complainant wants to file a formal complaint, and to just talk them through the process. So honestly, your Title IX coordinator could sit down with the complainant and just go through this flow chart with them and say, look, if you want to do a formal complaint, here's what it's going to look like. At that point, you also determine if emergency removal or some sort of other measure is appropriate if there's a health and safety concern. Now, on the left side, this is where if the complainant doesn't want to do a formal complaint. If they don't want to do a formal complaint, 99% of the time, everything really ends there, unless the Title IX coordinator moves forward on their own. That's kind of the where there's smoke, there's fire rule. Supportive measures could also continue or discontinue with the Title IX coordinator's direction, but most of the time, it's just going to end there. We don't do anything else. However, on the right side of the flow chart, if the complainant says, yes, I want to do a formal complaint, I want to go through this process, they need to tell you that within 10 days, 10 school days, because you don't want them to come back 6 months later and say yes. You want to know right then. They're going to have that conversation, and then within 10 days, tell the Title IX coordinator they want to proceed. Then the school determines if that complaint should be dismissed or consolidated. Next slide. So on the left side of the flow chart, if the school decides that that complaint should be dismissed or consolidated, the complainant can appeal that decision. So for example, Andrew suggested, if the complaint is, I was sexually harassed during a study abroad field trip, well, then the school could immediately dismiss that complaint because it's not under our scope. It was outside of the United States. We can't do anything about it. The complainant could appeal that. However, on the right side of your flow chart, if the school does decide to go ahead and proceed with the formal complaint, there's no reason to dismiss it. We're going to first give written notice. This is where the 5 school days comes into play. In most scenarios, you would hear us say, if there's some sort of investigation that needs to take place, you want to do it right away. You want to get the kids in, you want to talk to them. Not the case right now under Title IX. Under Title IX, new regs, you have to give written notice to both parties, which would include all those things Andrew went over, the process, the right to an advisor, what the informal resolution process looks like. You have to give that to them 5 school days before you interview them. You have to give them 5 days heads up of what the process looks like before you sit down and talk with the kids. Again, this doesn't negate DCS reporting obligations or anything like that, but you are not allowed to sit down and have the initial interview with either party until they have had at least 5 days heads up of that written notice. That's all new under the new regulations. Okay, next slide. Go ahead.
Well, so the 5 days notice goes to the student and the parents.
Correct.
Correct? That's in the regulations.
Correct. All right, so then the kids get the written notice, the parents get the written notice, and they decide after they read the written notice, well, informal resolution sounds a lot better because it's going to be spelled out in the written notice. So on the left side, they both might agree to informal resolution. In that case, we don't do an investigation. Our process really ends there, and that's when you kind of have your mediation process. However, if you still have a party that wants to go through with the formal investigation, then you start your investigation. Interviews, witnesses, review of records, both parties present evidence. That is usually going to take about 30 school days, although there is nothing in the regulations that says you have to get it done in a certain amount of time. Okay, then you do the review of evidence where both parties are provided all evidence. They are given 10 school days to respond. You need to have non-disclosure agreements required before you exchange that evidence. At the same time, the investigator, the Title IX coordinator is preparing the report that summarizes all of the relevant evidence. And then next slide, then you have to give the report to both parties, and then you have your exchange of questions. And that's where the parties submit to the decision maker written relevant questions. Both submissions are due 10 days after the receipt of the investigation report. And then the decision maker can follow up with follow-up questions to either party. That's going to take another 30 school days or so because you're changing answers and then you're going back with follow-up answers. So that's going to take another period of time. Next slide. Then your decision maker issues your written final decision, including disciplinary sanctions if applicable within a reasonable amount of time. No deadlines there. And then you have the appeal process. If either party doesn't like the final determination, they can appeal within 10 school days of receiving it, at which point your appellate body, either your one school board member or your neighboring district or your attorney, looks through the investigation report and the decision in about 45 school days and then gives their advice back to the decision maker. You can see that this whole process can take months. Absolutely. I mean, there is no reason why this would get done within like 2 or 3 months, if not more. So that's another reason why we think it's going to have a chilling effect on these formal processes, because once a person sees how long it takes, it's likely that they're not going to want to go through with the whole process.
Okay, Jessica, we have a couple questions on that process at different points, so I think I will go ahead and ask those of you. One question is, if we use the school board member as the appeal representative, should we make that designation at the January reorganization meeting? Or should it just be more fluid and appoint the person at the time of a formal complaint?
That's a good question, John. Andrew, I'd be interested in your thoughts, and Julie, but honestly, I think you should just wait and make it more fluid.
My reaction was to wait because there could be a conflict or something. So.
Well, it's also kind of a signal that says we may have these. I don't know if you want to send that signal. So, and again, you might, it might be a year later where you want to use a council or a board member may change your mind and not be willing to do it. Plus, you're also going to have to train the board member too. So.
Yeah.
And then the next one is an investigator, decision maker, appellate person entitled to consult legal counsel, and if so, to what degree can the same legal counsel consult with more than one of these persons?
Yes, they can consult with counsel. I would highly suggest they consult with counsel as they go through this. And they can consult with the same legal counsel. So you have to have 3 separate people who are, investigator, decision maker, appellate person, but there's no limitation on who they are allowed to consult with.
They could consult with like the school attorney.
Yes.
And does the decision maker determine whether or not to hear the appeal?
So the decision maker has to decide whether or not there are one of those 3 grounds for appeal. So that would be the conflict of interest, the bias, or new evidence, or sorry, the third one's escaping me. New evidence, conflict of interest, or procedural irregularity. If one of those 3 things happen, it's not up to the decision maker. You have to have an appeal. If one of those 3 things didn't happen, if the person who's asking for an appeal is just saying, I don't like it, I don't like how you did it, and I can't name one of these 3 reasons, I just don't like it, it's up to the decision maker whether or not they actually go through with the appeal or not.
Okay, so the decision maker makes the determination of one of those 3.
Correct.
Are present. Okay.
Correct. Okay.
So we have some scenarios in the Q&A. Do you, is it time to go to that? Okay.
Time to go to the hypotheticals, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's add that into hypos.
Okay, so a female student reports that a male student exposed himself to her one time. Could Dean investigate that right away, or should he report to Title IX before talking with the students and following the grievance procedure? It would help if I could read and talk at the same time.
Oh, okay, I see. And we're in the question answer. Jessica,
Yeah,
so it's in this question answer, female student reports one time exposure. I would think we do need to let the dean know.
But should that be reported to Title IX coordinator as well?
Yeah, I think that relates to an earlier question that was asked, is it's kind of a dual responsibility. You've got obviously a Title IX issue there where you need to get your Title IX coordinator involved, but also you just have a general student code of conduct issue too. I would certainly say get both involved simultaneously. Separate the students, do your supportive measures, get counseling, whatever, but then to actually interview for a Title IX reason. If the female student says, I want to go forward with a formal complaint, that's when you have your 5-day written notice issue to talk to a kid. But you don't even know if you're doing a Title IX investigation at that point. All you have is a report. You don't have a formal complaint yet. So you're responding to the report of sexual harassment, not do we have a full-blown grievance process yet.
Right.
And I'm assuming that if that would go to a formal complaint, part of the investigation, the person could go back and talk to the dean.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And to say, hey, what did the
Yes.
kids tell you during your investigation of the student?
Yes, keep in mind that this is where kind of the exchanging of evidence comes into play. I suppose notes taken by the dean originally only kept with the dean wouldn't, but if you start to then draw them into being a witness or evidence, they would have to exchange those eventually.
Right,
So
right. So you may want to consider that in talking to the dean, but the dean potentially could be a witness in the investigation. There's one in the chat that says, can they waive the delay? I'm not sure what Tom meant by that.
The 5-day delay, the 5-day delay is prescribed in the regulations. So if they do waive it and say, you can go ahead and talk to me right now, I would want that in writing. Because if not, you could be accused of violating the regulations.
Jessica, why don't we just do a couple of our high notes, just a couple of them.
Which ones do you want to do?
Let's do number 1.
Okay.
All right. A teacher reports to you, Title IX coordinator for your district, that 2 female students, Rosa and Tyra, were sexually assaulted by male student Ralph. When you contacted Rosa and Tyra, they both deny anything happened between them and Ralph. How do you proceed? Let's stop there before you read the second part. Okay, on the Q&A or chat feature, if you've got any answers, you can post anonymously, or if you want to post your name, whatever you prefer. But what's the answer here? When you contact Rosa and Tyra, they both deny anything happened between them and Ralph. How do you proceed? Wait for dramatic pause. Anyone? I'm going to call on Julie or Jessica if we don't get audience participation.
Oh, here we go.
It's
Rosa
there.
says ends there.
So I think we could do a devil's advocate. I might say
Oh, here's another one.
I might say it ends there because you may not have information as the Title IX coordinator to show that it meets the definition of sexual harassment. Jessica, you want to take an opposite or devil's advocate view of that?
I could make the argument with a straight face that where there's smoke, there's fire. And if you have at least 2 female students who you think that there's at least 2 female victims, there might be more. And so if I don't at least look into it a little bit, I might be deliberately indifferent. There's no magic number though. So I mean, 2, 5, I think it's got to be a very fact dependent determination. But I could make a smoke, there's fire kind of argument for that and say the Title IX coordinators should sign off and do it on their own.
Yeah, that's what Lindsey Brown said. If the teacher witnessed the event or believed it happened, then the Title IX coordinator may proceed with the investigation on their own. And I would agree with that.
What if we add here that Rosa wishes to proceed with the investigation anonymously?
And then Tom also asked, would you talk to Ralph? I would talk to Ralph. I would talk to the alleged respondent. But if Rosa wants, go ahead.
Keep in mind, 'cause even if it's not a Title IX, it might have been a
Yeah.
disciplinary incident. Now, if you talk to Ralph and it leads to more information that it's a Title IX incident, then you conceivably, as the Title IX coordinator, could file the complaint yourself or sign it yourself.
Right.
But Jess, what about if Rosa wishes to proceed anonymously?
And that's where if you want to do a formal complaint, you can't do it anonymously. The only way that could happen is if the Title IX coordinator stepped in and did it on their own. Because if you have to exchange evidence, you have to go through the due process piece, it means you give up confidentiality. You can't do it anonymously.
And I think that's where the Title IX coordinator would have to explain to Rosa what the process is. I mean, even though it's not a formal written notice, that's where information can be exchanged with the students as to, hey, if you decide to go this route, this is what's going to happen.
Let's do hypothetical number 3. Keisha reports allegations of sexual harassment and racial discrimination. How should you address the 2 different types of discrimination? Anyone rolling in here? We're giving bonus points to those that have stayed on.
Shelley says, could you combine them?
You could. I'm going to say you could. This is all new. Keeping in mind that your process for Title IX is the process. I mean, if you result in a finding that there's also racial discrimination, as long as you use the steps that we just went over today, you could do that.
I would agree. Yes, I think you have to keep in mind the racial discrimination investigation is not as involved, the requirements of it are not as involved as the Title IX sexual harassment grievance procedure. So that is the one you would have to default to if you're going to combine racial and sexual harassment complaints. Tom also asked, when is it appropriate to contact the police even when you're conducting an informal investigation?
Yeah, well, let's go back to hypothetical number 2, because that one actually touches on that. The receiver report there was a big party over the weekend where Ivan allegedly sexually assaulted Alicia. A concurrent report was made to local law enforcement. When you, the district Title IX coordinator, contact Alicia, she reports that other students have been harassing her in the hallway. Do you investigate? What if law enforcement asks you to delay your investigation? Ooh.
So I'll just point out this hypothetical came from a real case where the sexual assault happened off campus, off hours. However, the taunting and the harassing happened on campus, on hours. So that even under the new Title IX regulations, where you try to draw this line between what do we have substantial control over and what don't we, and what's the scope of our programs and what isn't, it's the taunting piece that still would trigger your Title IX obligations. That's happening in the scope of the educational activity. So I want to kind of put that parameter around this hypothetical.
We're starting to, your audio is starting to chop out a little, Jess.
Sorry.
Yeah, and Jessica, I would just make the point that I agree with you, the taunting in the hallway would be the Title IX trigger, but that would not necessarily be a crime that you would report to the law enforcement. So the weekend event may be something you put in the law enforcement person's hand, although that could also be a violation of your student discipline code, but which you would have to investigate as well. But yeah, as far as Title IX is concerned, the taunting in the hallway would be what you need to investigate as the school under the new regulations.
I think my reaction, there's a question posted, when is it appropriate to contact the police? I'm still, sooner the better, especially if it's a potential child abuse or neglect, obviously. But in any case where we think that there's a assault, there's a bullying, and it has potential criminal or juvenile implications, the contact can happen or should happen immediately.
Yes.
Now, having a relationship with your local law enforcement where you explain to them that you're obligated to still do your investigation, that is more of a local, political, and relationship issue to work through. Explaining that the Office of Civil Rights, U.S. Department of Education, maybe you can sit down with law enforcement and go over the PowerPoint with them.
Right.
But, you know, you're going to have that relationship where you explain to them you're obligated to go forward.
Right, that's a very good point. And had a follow-up. Yeah, as a general question, accusations of sexual harassment is a criminal act, and you should be contacting the police. But just because the police are investigating doesn't mean you can't investigate under your own student due process or student discipline code. And especially, you still need to go forward with Title IX, as Andrew just said. You're obligated to do that. And I think you need to, as he pointed out, you need to talk with your law enforcement people to let them know that. So it's kind of a concurrent investigation. And again, the police have a different standard. They have other things they're investigating, so their investigation may not go as quickly as yours would under Title IX or even under your discipline code.
There is a lot of information packed in. I know we started losing some participants. We're still over 100 right now, but you know, oftentimes when attorneys do presentations on legal updates, it's, you know, regurgitating things that we've maybe told you in previous seminars. But this is new. This is a lot of information. Certainly is going to take more training and more conversation at your school corporation on all of the information today. So that's my summary, and I'll pause. But thank Indiana School Board Association and Julie and Lisa and Jessica for having us. Jessica.
All right. Yeah, we have one more question.
Yeah.
What if the principal is part of an initial investigation of a report for a discipline matter that moves to a formal complaint? If the principal is also the Title IX coordinator, does this create any issue of conflict of interest? Is the information obtained by the principal prior to the formal complaint admissible?
I would say it does not create a conflict of interest. If anything, it kind of jump-started your investigation, really. The question of I think you could certainly still use the information that the principal obtained prior to the filing of the formal complaint, but I would almost want to do like the same questions over again as part of your formal complaint, even if it feels very repetitive, to number one, judge the credibility of the answers and make sure that the answers stayed the same, but also to indicate, you know, okay, now we're going into a formal Title IX thing. I need to ask you some of the same questions. I'm going to ask you more questions based on everything else that I've heard, but it might be a little repetitive.
Right, and again, here again is where we have to consider that at the end of the Title IX grievance procedure, the information is going to get exchanged. So do we want that initial investigation for discipline matter to be part of that investigation report that has to be exchanged? So that's just a call. And I think we have about 5 more minutes. Any other questions real quickly to wrap up? I know there are going to be a lot of questions once you start looking into this, and I guess we have another one. If an incident is investigated and disciplined, a suspension delivered under the code of conduct, and then a formal complaint is filed, are there issues you see with that? I'm wondering if the question is getting to, you discipline them under the code of conduct.
Yeah.
Can you discipline again under the Title IX complaint procedure? But I'm thinking probably.
I would think so, but remember too, there's this whole new world of this supportive measures, and supportive measures aren't supposed to be punitive, excuse me. So they're not supposed to be punitive and unreasonably burdensome to the respondent. So if you disciplined them, that could, I don't know what the penalty for that is. It just says you're not supposed to be punitive to the respondent. So I would think maybe you hold off on your discipline if you can to complete the Title IX investigation.
I would agree with that. I think if there's any situation you get that appears to be, it's going to be sexual harassment leading to a Title IX investigation, that probably should be pursued first, because that is more intense. It will lead to some kind of resolution. So that probably should be a question asked first before we go into the discipline route. What do you think, Jessica?
No, I agree. I mean, keep in mind, if under the flow chart, you basically have 2 days to talk to the complainant if they want a formal complaint or not. They have 10 days to get back to you. So the longest is 12 school days that you would be waiting to discipline someone. And even if the complainant said, I don't want to go forward with a formal complaint, I don't want to go down the Title IX path, you might still say, look, this is still a violation of our student code of conduct. We still want to suspend the alleged harasser for a couple of days because we have enough information to say, we're still going to discipline them under the code of conduct, whether or not you go forward with a formal complaint.
Yeah. I think we're bumping up close to 4 o'clock. Don't see, I think we got one more. There's a liability question. Would or could a district be held liable for determining that sexual harassment does not exist? I think that's going to be based on the investigation and your records.
Yeah, it's going to, we talked about this earlier with respect to deliberate indifference.
Yes.
And so if we can show that we gave supportive measures, or we can show that we properly, I suppose there's going to be liability if we don't follow the Title IX procedures as we're supposed to, and then we found there's no responsibility or sexual harassment. So that could be an issue. But if you follow the procedures and you come to a decision, there's no responsibility or no sexual harassment, then that should go a long way in arguing that we were not deliberately indifferent.
Yeah, I'll piggyback from what Andrew said, but if we can drive home any message at the end of this presentation, well, first of all, it's don't beat us up. We're just the messenger. That's what we need to drive home first. But if we could drive home a substantive message at any point, it's if your procedures are written and you follow your procedures, we have plenty of case law that says a court will not question your outcome if your procedure was accurate. There's a lot of judges that say, look, I'm not in the classroom, I'm not in the building, I'm not going to question the expertise of the school administrators of the outcome that they reached, but I will question how they got to the outcome. So your best defense against liability is to say, look, we have written procedures for how to handle a grievance procedure, and we know that we followed them accurately. Here's the documentation to show that we followed them accurately. And then your court's going to say, okay, whatever your outcome was, we're going to trust it because you followed your procedures.
Right, unless maybe that it's just obvious, the evidence was just so obvious against your decision. But yeah, I would agree. It's mostly going to be your procedures and being sure that you follow them. I have right at 4 o'clock. Again, I want to thank Andrew and Jessica for presenting for us today. We have a lot of questions on the new regulations because they are new. Even the attorneys have questions, and it's like every new regulation, we just have to wait for it to go through the courts. And as Andrew mentioned earlier, that can be 3 or 4 years. And these may change next year, depending on what administration gets elected. So just do the best you can. If you have any questions, call ISBA, call your local attorney, and they'll be happy to help you. with that, I will say have a nice evening. It's a nice day out there, at least in Indianapolis. So get out there and enjoy the nice weather and have a great evening, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you.
Thank you all.